Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto turns into a fox during a full moon. Pre-timescope, no Biju, Konoha is a village of ninjas who hunt demons. Naruto is a ninja with secrets. And tonight is the night of a full moon. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 51, Invasion. Isamu struggled mightily not to fidget as he and his squad oversaw a group of Otonin preparing for a summoning. It was possible to summon a demon bound to a contract without having signed that contract, but it was so difficult that it was rarely done. However, Orochimaru had gone through all the trouble of creating the dozens of small scrolls and instructing the necessary ninjas in how to form the circle so that one of his giant snakes could open the wall for them. This was the last place that Isamu wanted to be. He was minutes away from getting involved in a real fight where he could die. And the idea of dying terrified him. "I wish I never met you, die," a tiny voice in the back of his mind wailed. "I never wanted this honor to be in the first wave. Why couldn't I have the honor of defending the village while all the crazy, fearless foxes attack Konoha?" But Udai had assigned him this task and he had no choice but to follow through with it. If he backed out, Udai would punish him. Death would be a kindness compared to what he could expect if he betrayed his leader in any way. He thought of the poor alcoholic two-tails he'd watched Udai casually send off to Orochimaru's lab and what it must have been like for the old man to be sliced open and studied while he'd still been alive, and he shuddered. "I never thought he'd get this far." A signal was passed to the circle of Otonin and they activated the summoning circle that they'd formed with their bodies and the scrolls draped over their laps. There was an enormous explosion of white smoke, and as it cleared, a gigantic lesser snake demon was revealed. It had odd patterns on its scales and two hissing heads. The dual-headed serpent got its bearings and then slithered towards Konohagakuer no Sado's towering eastern wall. And when it reached that wall, it battered its way through with its enormous coils, forming a gap for the Otonin and Isamu and his small squad to get inside. If I had known this could happen, I would never have been his friend. He drew a kunai with a sweaty, trembling hand, and joined the other shinobi in rushing through the demolished wall. But it's too late now, much too late. In the sky to the north of Konoha, dozens of flocks of crow tengu wheeled and cawed. At their heart glided nearly 50 eagle tengu, fierce eyes glazed and empty. Metal shackles weighed down their forearms and metal collars hung around their necks. Ordinarily the independent and aggressive eagle demons would never gather in such numbers, and never tolerate the crows that fluttered around them. But nothing about what was going on was ordinary. Signal tags clutched in the claws of some crow tengu went off and the black-feathered horde immediately soared towards the leaf village, the eagles gliding clumsily in their wake. The plunder and chaos long promised to them was finally at hand and they were very eager to get started. Once they crossed over the outer walls, scores of crow demons dove down into the streets to steal whatever sparkling things they could find and attack the few civilians not in the village stadium. A small selection of crows remained high in the sky. They were the controllers of the eagle tengu, and when they spied a clump of ninja they released their charges. Suddenly no longer docile, the eagle tengu plummeted towards their targets with shrieks of fury and madness. The man-sized demon birds struck with razor claws and hooked beaks, and some carried their foes aloft only to drop them from heights that were fatal. The air rang with eagle screams, hoarse crow caws, and the terrified shrieks of humans, and it was only just beginning. At Konoha's western wall, shadowy shapes scuttled out of the brush and started scaling them. More than 100 spider demons rubbed dripping fangs together as they anticipated the human prey they would find beyond this stone barrier. These were not the sort of spider demons that spun webs and waited behind illusions to trap their prey, they were the kind that ran down their food and only used silk to carry off their catches. Normally they didn't strike deals with food. But fox meat tasted bitter. Human flesh tasted far sweeter, and usually was much easier to obtain. So when foxes had promised them all the humans they could eat and more, each one of them had decided to go along with it. Now it was time to move. The arachnids flowed over the walls, pouncing on the small number of shinobi that had been patrolling it. Covering the corpses with silk for later collection, the spider demons rushed down the walls and into the village streets seeking for more food. It was entering into autumn now, and even though it rarely snowed in winter, the season was still a leaner time for them, so any extra food now was more than welcome. To Konoha's south were the werewolves. There were roughly 80 of them, most of them under Uzushio control. They sat motionless, drooling, and unnaturally calm. But that was only because of the seal-stamped collars around their necks and shackles hanging on their wrists. The werewolves' handlers waited nearby. Some were tense as they paced and fidgeted. Others lounged around with the only outward sign of anxiety were their fingering of the control cuffs. When the signal for action came through, all of the ninja were on their feet and ready for action. Channeling chakra through their control cuffs, they set their captive werewolves shambling towards Konoha's southern wall. A few yards from the base of the wall, the controllers adjusted some of the seals on their cuffs. The change turned the beasts from docile and drooling into maddened berserkers. The cursed beasts broke into a dead sprint and attacked the wall. They dug their claws into the tiny cracks between bricks and surged upwards. When they reached the top of the wall, they shredded a small Konoha patrol unfortunate enough to be in their way before they spilled down into the village. They poured into the streets like a murderous flood of teeth and claws. Werewolves that were normal would never charge into any human settlement, let alone one the size of Konoha that was protected by such a massive wall the way that these beasts were. These werewolves felt no fear, no fatigue, no pain. All they knew was rage and hunger and the need to destroy, and as long as their bodies would move they would fight. Following a safe distance behind them, their controllers smiled ugly smiles. Uchiha Fugaku sat in the garden behind his home and meditated. He wasn't entirely sure what he should do with himself now that he was no longer in direct control of the military police. Izuna was now the official chief of the military police, but in reality he was barely more than a figurehead who made few judgment calls himself. Every important decision was brought before Fugaku for approval or rejection. However, now that he was no longer immersed in all the minute details of the military police, he found himself with the odd hour here and there where he didn't even have clan business to occupy his time. His free time felt even more pronounced with his immediate family out of the house. Itachi spent all his waking hours at his desk in the military police headquarters or out on patrol. Mikoto had moved in with her disgraceful foreign friend, and Sasuke. Fugaku grimaced and struggled to clear his mind. He had many problems that needed solutions and he couldn't let himself be distracted by things which couldn't be changed. So he rubbed briefly at the eye patch which covered his lost eye and reapplied himself to considering his clan's recent difficulties. Assassination seems to be the best way to go, he mused, closing his remaining eye. Sarutobi shows no signs of stepping down. He doesn't even have a successor lined up. That could work in our favor. Any successor that he selects will doubtless have similar weaknesses. If Sarutobi can be removed without a successor, we have a chance to putting forward a proper candidate to the daimyo. But should it be done as soon as we formulate a plan of action that will keep us above suspicion, or months down the line? Time could improve our situation, eh? Fugaku-sama. The one-eyed Uchiha frowned and turned to see Izuna striding around the side of his house. His cousin was a few years younger than he was and an iron-willed, loyal member of the Uchiha. One look at Izuna's face was all Fugaku needed to know that something serious was going on. Yes. Fugaku prompted as his kinsman drew to his side. Konoha is under attack, Izuna said without preamble. It started in the stadium, and now all the outer walls are under assault. So far we have reports of demon crows and eagles, spider demons, werewolves, at least one giant snake summon, and ninja of Otagaku or no Sato. There has also been one unconfirmed report of Uzushionin participation. Shall I pass the order along for all Uchiha to withdraw to defend clan lands? Fugaku considered it for a minute before reluctantly shaking his head. No, we are to defend the village as a whole. Why? Izuna demanded, his eyes glittering with dark fury. They have insulted, belittled, and threatened us. Why should we risk our warriors' lives to defend them? Abandoning them, regardless of how justified it would be, would only inspire the rest of the village to take further steps against us. It could even lead to a civil war, which would cause pointless loss of life. Fugaku stiffly rose to his feet. However, in defending them, we remind Konoha at large how much they need us. It has been a very long time since this village has engaged in full-scale war and they have forgotten how vital the Uchiha clan is to its existence. Izuna hesitated, then nodded. I'll send out the orders now. Good, Fugaku smiled thinly. I will go wait in my old office for updates. With another nod, Izuna departed at a run. Fugaka watched him go for a moment before jogging off to the headquarters of the military police. An invasion, how convenient. Depending on how it turns out, we might scrape up enough gratitude to force Sarutobi to back off. Or perhaps he'll end up dying in the fighting. Either outcome is perfectly acceptable. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Doso started to slice Neji's neck open. The tip of his blade started just under the Hyuga's left ear as was dragged brutally towards the right. Doso froze, slight tremors quivering along his arm, just before he could slice open Neji's jugular. Naruto blinked dizzily and tried to see why he'd stopped, but he couldn't spot any reason. He swallowed hard and struggled to his knees so that he could hopefully tackle Doso before the Oto Genin could start up again. "Release me!" Doso snarled. "What the hell?" Naruto wondered. "Who's he talking to?" "Troublesome," Shikamaru muttered. Naruto jumped slightly and snapped his head over to where Shikamaru had been sleeping. The Nara boy was now awake, if he'd ever been asleep at all, and had used his shadow technique to paralyze Doso. And now Shikamaru was standing, careful to move so that Doso would be forced to pull the kunai from Neji's neck without causing further damage. "Why couldn't you have let me sleep?" Shikamaru complained. "Release me," Doso repeated, his one visible eye narrowed in hatred. "Not yet," was Shikamaru's lazy response. Naruto frowned, puzzled, and then he saw the bugs. Tiny beetles were streaming up Doso's legs and disappearing into the gaps in his clothing and bandages. And the little beetles were pouring out of Shino's coat. Apparently the Aburame hadn't been asleep either, and although Doso's sonic attack had taken him to his knees, he was still functioning enough to siphon away the Oto Genin's chakra. Neji wheezed and wriggled out from under Doso, clamping a hand to the very bloody but non-fatal wound on the left side of his neck. Someone helped him by grabbing one of his ankles and dragging him backwards. Naruto was a bit startled when he saw that it was the older Taki Genin that were taking care of him, but at least neither of them seemed to be part of the chaos like Doso was. "Now tell us," Shikamaru drawled, "what exactly is going on?" "You'll find out soon enough," Doso growled. "That is, if you survive." And then, with a tremendous jerk, and probably a hefty burst of chakra, Doso pulled himself free of Shikamaru's jutsu. The Oto Genin staggered and slapped at himself to try and kill Shino's bugs. But before he could smash very many, Lee swept in and slammed a fist into Doso's mostly hidden face, sending the Otonin staggering into the concrete wall. The green-clad boy swayed slightly, his balance still clearly affected by Doso's technique. "Your behavior is most dishonorable and unyouthful," Lee declared. "Explain yourself." Doso snarled and raised his gauntlet again. Shin slammed the hilt of one of his knives into Doso's skull and the genin crumpled to the ground, unconscious. "I do not want to puke again." Shin snarled and gave the Oto Genin a savage kick to the side before he retreated to his female teammate's side. "Troublesome," Shikamaru muttered. "So much for getting answers." "Not my problem," the teenager from Taki shrugged. Shino knelt by Doso's body and started binding the foreign genin's wrists and ankles together while his tiny beetles returned to the folds of his coat. Naruto shook his head, relieved that he didn't feel horribly dizzy from the motion, and turned his foxish gaze back down into the arena. The proctor had defeated a few of his attackers and had moved on up to fight other Otonin in the stands. Sasuke was well out of sight now, but Naruto figured he'd kept moving in a straight line unless something or someone got into his way. And, "Hey, there's Mom." He grinned at the sight of her, her long red hair waving in the wind like a banner, as she surged down the steep wall from the stands into the arena pit. A dark-haired woman, probably Sasuke's mother, was hard on her heels. The two adult kunoichi paused, scanned the arena, checked one of the demons that Sasuke had killed, and then vanished down one of the tunnels that led down into the chambers where the demons were held. "Weird, I thought they'd go after Sasuke." Sasuke. It had been minutes since the ex-Uchiha had escaped from the arena. There was no telling where he was, what he was doing, or what sort of trouble he was in. Naruto lurched into motion, eager to make up for lost time. "Come on, let's go get Sasuke," Naruto cried. Without waiting for any agreement or plan of action, he grabbed Shikamaru's arm and dragged the Nara with him over the metal railing. Naruto got Shikamaru down into the arena and halfway across the field before the other boy managed to dig in his heels. What? The blonde frowned. This is a battle for Chunin and Junin, Shikamaru sighed. We should just stay out of the way. And what's with your eyes? We're almost Chunin, Naruto argued. And we need to help Sasuke. No one outside of the stadium will recognize him now and they could attack him by mistake. We need to catch him before he runs into his relatives. He completely ignored Shikamaru's question. The Nara boy made a face and then sighed deeply. Troublesome. Let's go a back way. There's too much fighting up in the stands. Indeed, Shino agreed, seeming to materialize out of nowhere. Naruto jumped and squawked, and even Shikamaru flinched, but Shino only gestured back to the waiting area. We should make use of the interior corridors of the stadium complex. Why? Because all the fighting appears to be in the stands or on the roofs. He's right, Shikamaru agreed. Fighting in close quarters like inside of buildings is tricky and most ninja avoid it when they can. With the attack just starting, it's very unlikely that any enemy ninja have moved their fighting indoors. Okay, Naruto agreed and waved his fist. Let's get going, then. Hinata cowered in her side, wide-eyed and frozen with terror. She'd managed to recognize the genjutsu and break its hold over her in time, but now she had no idea what to do. Kiba, Akamaru, Ino, and Chuji had fallen asleep, but Sakura and Tenten had also escaped the sleep-inducing illusion, and now the pink-haired girl was waking the others up. And in the stands around them there were clumps of ninja fighting and seeking to kill each other. This wasn't supposed to happen. It shouldn't be possible. The trials were kept small, with only lesser ninja villages invited to participate to make this sort of invasion impossible. And this was an act of full-scale war, something that was barely a memory to the oldest ninja and a myth to the youngest. It couldn't be real. It had to be a waking nightmare. It had to be the second layer of a complex genjutsu. But when Hinata using the genjutsu breaking technique that Kurenye-sensei had long drilled her the view of the insane, impossible battle didn't change in the slightest. What's going on? Chuji asked sleepily after Sakura broke the illusion on him. An act of war, Tenten answered, her brown eyes sharp and flickering from different clumps of fighting. We need to arm ourselves. Man, all my weapons are at home. Kiba growled bitterly. What are we going to do? Ino fussed. My uncle has a weapons shop several blocks from here, Tenten said. If we can get there we can. An enemy ninja noticed that their genin group was awake and he and one of his comrades sprinted along the backs of chairs towards them. Tenten stole snacks and drinks from nearby unconscious spectators and hurled them at the Oto ninja. One took a cup of sake to the face and he tripped as the alcohol burned his eyes, but the other kept coming. Tenten leapt to meet him and managed to hold him off with pure taijutsu long enough to steal one of his kunai. The other Oto ninja recovered from the drink to the face and tried to double-team Tenten, but Kiba and Akamaru intercepted him. The Inyazuka fighting style and their specially bred canine companions made them dangerous opponents, even when the human half of the fighting pair lacked any steel blades. Akamaru splashed the adult ninja's face with urine, which burned and blinded even worse than the sake had, and then boy and puppy struck, slashed, and bit their foe. Chuji crouched in his seat, practically useless. His clan techniques were all about growing in size and smashing the enemy, and if he tried it in the stands he was guaranteed to crush and kill helpless Konoha civilians. So he sat there, watched Tenten and Kiba fight, and worked on finishing off his bag of potato chips. Ino was almost as useless. Sure, she could possess the enemy and turn him against his fellows, but if her attempt failed her body would be helpless and defenseless for several precious seconds. And if the body that she possessed was significantly injured or killed before she could leave it, the damage would be brought back to her body. Sakura looked just as terrified and frozen as Hinata felt. The pink-haired girl had no real clan techniques to speak of. Her family was small and had only started becoming ninja a few generations back. They had no specialized fighting style or magical techniques. And Sakura was the only one of her family with any training or experience in field work. A third Otonin spotted their battle and was sprinting in to help his fellows. He aimed for Tenten and hefted a kunai to throw. The bun-haired girl still only had the one blade she'd snagged from her opponent and she had no real way to defend herself. Tenten was in real trouble now. The Otonin stopped 2 rows back from Hinata's seat and drew his arm back to throw. Hinata's problem was that she always thought too much. She feared and she worried, and her imagination raced to picture all the ways that she could fail, that her teammates could be hurt by her. And it would always lead her to move too slowly, to freeze up. So she didn't think, she acted. The Hyuga girl launched out of her seat, signing and activating her ocular Kekai Genkai as she moved. One step cleared 1 row of seats, another cleared the second. The enemy noticed her and turned to slash at her with the blade he'd intended to hurl at Tenten. He was far too slow. Her hand struck at his wrist like a snake, and the blast of chakra from her palm paralyzed and destroyed muscles and tendons, causing the throwing knife to tumble harmlessly from his grasp. He snarled and tried to bring up his other arm to knock her aside, but her hands moved like lightning. She struck his knee, the shoulder of his undamaged arm, and then she landed a double strike. One palm slapped left of his sternum, the other clapped against his throat. The Otonin coughed up a spray of blood and toppled backwards to land half in a sleeping woman's lap. He gurgled and twitched feebly for a minute. And then he went terribly still, his eyes unfocused and unseeing. I killed him. That horrifying realization utterly destroyed the odd fighting trance she'd fallen into, and she perched on the back of a stadium chair, frozen. I killed a man. She hadn't slain a demon. She had snuffed out a human life. She had killed a human being. The clash of steel and angry shouts of battle faded into muffled nothingness. Color returned to her vision as her Byakugan relaxed, only to leach back out into shades of gray instead of shades of violet. Acidic terror burned at the back of her throat and her mind teetered on the precipice of shock. A flash of bold green at the corner of her eye jolted her away from staring at the man that she'd killed. Rock Lee pummeled away another enemy, one that had been charging towards her with murder in his eyes, with a mighty kick. As the adult ninja cartwheeled away, the odd genin that was part of her cousin's team gave her a quick smile and a big thumbs up. An amazing display of skill, Hinata-san. Your youthful power prevailed. The strange genin declared, his teeth practically shining. Come, let us go to Tenten's family shop and arm ourselves. Clinging to Lee's praise like a lifeline, Hinata timidly nodded and allowed Sakura to drag her along with the others as they fled the stands for the exit and hopefully a store of blades. I wish Kurenye-sensei was here. Sarutobi Konohamaru was horribly bored. He'd been hoping to attend the trials this year, but his unauthorized jaunt outside the village walls months ago had ruined any chance of that. So he and his friends and all the other kids in his class were stuck in school, being bored to death by their teachers. This stinks so bad. The Hokage's grandson sighed wearily as his pencil doodled aimlessly on the margins of his worksheet. To his left, Udon was waging his old war with his running nose and some tissues. And to his right, Mogi was drawing with crayons on some blank paper, having already finished all the worksheets the Chunin teacher had handed out at the start of class. I wish something interesting would happen, Konohamaru sulked. A door at the back of the classroom slid open and a Chunin teacher from another class slipped inside. She rushed to the front of the room and whispered something urgently to Iruka-sensei and the substitute Chunin filling in for Gato-sensei. After a little more whispering, the visiting Chunin left and Iruka-sensei called the class to attention. Konohamaru grinned in excitement briefly, until he recognized the grim look on Iruka-sensei's face. All right class, change of plans, the scar-faced Chunin announced. We're going to take a quick field trip to the cliff tunnels. Clean off your desks and fall into line. Iruka tried not to snap impatiently at his young students as he and the other Chunin instructors struggled to get their students out of the school building. It was imperative that they got all the students into the safety of the ancient lava tubes hidden behind the cliffs that rose up behind Hokage Tower, where the dozens of faces of the old Hokages had been carved. Of course the students had no idea how important it was that they got there quickly. They thought it was just a field trip to entertain and possibly educate them. Telling them the truth would only incite panic. It was hard to believe that Konoha was under attack, but it had to be true. A squad of Umbu had stopped by the teacher's lounge to alert the off-duty teachers of the danger, so there was no question of the reality of the threat. So Iruka and the other academy instructors had to implement the evacuation plans that hadn't been seriously employed for nearly a century. Perhaps we could make it into a race? Iruka pondered as he steered his class through the hallways and out the doors. That would get them to the tunnels in less than 15 minutes. But it wouldn't be very stealthy. Just outside of the academy building, only a few feet short of the gates to the campus, the crowd of young students and the few handfuls of adult Chunin teachers ground to a halt. Iruka almost yelled ahead to see what the holdup was. But then he saw the problem and his blood ran icy cold. Waiting for them at the gates were foreign ninja, almost 30 of them. They were dressed mostly in black, with dark gray flak jackets, and their hitayate had a spiral etched into the metal plates. But the enemy ninja paled in comparison to what they brought with them. Werewolves. At least 10 of them. They wore metal collars and wrist monocles. It didn't matter that they appeared oddly docile and seemed perfectly obedient to the foreign ninjas that commanded them. The creatures were still dangerous. One good bite and... "How nice of you to come out and meet us," one of the foreign ninjas cried with a cruel smile. "It saves us the trouble of going inside and rounding up the brats ourselves." "To kill us?" one bold, or foolish, child asked loudly into the fearful silence. "No, our pets won't kill you," the spokes ninja for the group answered, his smile growing even crueler. "They just want to chew on you a bit." Chapter 52, Chaos. Orochimaru almost didn't dodge the blue fireballs. Human-spawned cat-on attacks were always, except for a few fabled Uchiha jutsu, the ordinary colors of fire: red, orange, and yellow, sometimes with hints of white or blue. Any other color of fire was the result of demon chakra, sometimes referred to as yuki. Therefore, the blue fireballs that Furukawa Kaito had generated had to be genjutsu, or partial genjutsu. But when the fireballs failed to vanish or change color after the half-demon tried to dispel them, and when those fireballs left sizable craters in the roof where he had been standing, he saw that there was nothing illusory about them. And that raised a lot of very interesting questions. As much as Orochimaru loved knowledge and learning new things, he greatly preferred to do it outside of battle. Narrowing his golden eyes, Orochimaru snapped one of his arms at the elderly Uzashionin and a stream of small summoned snakes exploded from his sleeve. The stream of venomous vipers soared through the air, sharp fangs bared at their target. But Kaito wasn't the least bit impressed. Snapping through a few quick hand seals, he sprayed a tight blast of blue flame from his mouth that incinerated all of the snakes and singed the edge of Orochimaru's sleeve. "Really?" Kaito almost sneered, one eyebrow arched in inquiry. A flash of hot rage raced over Orochimaru's skin, but he forced it down and made it cold. "Tell me, Kaito-san, isn't your elemental affinity supposed to be Doton? How is it that you're throwing around Yuki-powered fireballs?" The half-snake tilted his head slightly. "That is, if you're really Furukawa Kaito at all, and not some unusually bold tanuki wearing his face. In all the years that I lived in Konoha, I was never seriously asked whether or not I was human at all," Kaito replied with a shrug and a thin smile. "Then what are you?" Orochimaru demanded. "I am what every Uzashio citizen is," Kaito replied, being thoroughly obscure. Orochimaru prepared a cutting remark, but discarded it in favor to dodging an attack from his left. His old sensei had quietly summoned his favorite monkey demon, Inma, while the Hanyu had been distracted. The towering white monkey king had turned himself into his staff form and the old Hokage tried to knock Orochimaru off his feet with it. "Finally getting into the fight, sensei." Orochimaru sneered and snapped out his unsinged sleeve, sending another stream of summoned serpents towards his former mentor. The range was too close for Sarutobi to dodge. As talented as he was with a bow staff, even the bulky staff form of Inma, there could be no way for him to sweep away all the poisonous snakes coming his way. But he never had to lift a finger to stop the snakes. A stream of blue fireballs courtesy of Kaito obliterated all of the venomous reptiles in seconds and set Orochimaru's unblemished sleeve on fire. "Your scaly pets won't be much use here," Kaito chided him. "Unless you call on the bigger ones, and there isn't much room in this little box you've made." Orochimaru hissed angrily, sounding very much like a snake himself. He sliced open a fingertip and summoned a slightly larger serpent, but didn't send it to attack either of his foes. Instead it disgorged a sword before vanishing again in a burst of smoke. "Why don't you tell your old friend to stand aside?" Orochimaru suggested to his old teacher. "This fight should be just between me and you, Sarutobi-sensei." He could see that the Hokage was considering it, but Kaito had to voice his own opinion. Now, Orochimaru, why should I let you go and mess with your old teacher's mind? The Furukawa man snorted. Why should I stand aside and let you and your teacher fight to the death and do nothing? The whole point of my being here is to make this a very unfair fight for you and ensure Konoha's victory. The demon man scoffed. I'm old but I'm no idiot. And besides, I'm not a Konoha ninja, so I don't have to listen to any of the Hokage's orders if I don't want to. He has a good point, the old Hokage shrugged. As much as I would like to correct my mistake on my own, it seems that I have no choice but to accept Kaito's help in the matter. Another hiss slipped through Orochimaru's teeth. He'd planned on fighting only one man, his old sensei. Now he had some kind of demon to contend with as well. Several techniques he'd planned on using, including his beloved Edo Tensei, would now be much harder to use, if not impossible. I doubt that Kaito will allow me to complete the summoning of the coffins, the Hanyu groused. What a pity. I'd picked out my favorite old Hokages for this occasion. I even managed to locate material to summon the Shodai himself. What a shame, I'll have to save him for some other time. Channeling chakra into his sword, he flung the blade into the air and Kusanagi took on a life of its own, zipping towards Kaito like a missile. With the swords to occupy the interloper, Orochimaru threw himself at his former teacher. It would be tricky to go against the old man without his sword, but it could be done. And he would do it. Eventually. His sensei was old and would be the first of the three of them to tire. Once he was dealt with, Orochimaru could focus his might on Kaito, the secret demon, and then get to the business of destroying Konoha. Iruka fell ill as he surveyed the deadly blockade. The foreign ninja smirked at the students who were paralyzed with fear and confusion, and their werewolf pets just crouched there, eyes unfocused, drooling, and waiting. And the lead ninja's words. No, our pets won't kill you. They just want to chew on you a bit. Killing helpless children, the youngest being barely 6 years old, was bad enough, but what those words implied. These foreigners weren't out to slaughter children, they were aiming to maul the children with werewolves so that if they survived they'd become werewolves themselves. And then the cursed children would either be forced to cower indoors on nights of the full moon for the rest of their lives, or Konoha would have to kill them as an act of mercy. Why do they want to chew on us? A young girl, frightened but not old enough and knowledgeable enough to be frightened enough, asked anxiously. Because we're going to tell them to, the spokes ninja replied, smirking cruelly. Why? A boy, probably a classmate of the girl's, wondered. To punish your village, another of the foreigners snarled. He was old. In fact, Iruka was startled to realize that more than half the foreigners looked at least as old as the Hokage. And while the younger members of this force were leering viciously at their young soon-to-be victims, the elders glared, eyes burning with hate. After far too long, my children will finally be avenged. The old man snapped harshly. At last Konoha will know how it feels. But Konoha has never harmed Uzushio children. One of the Chunin instructors sputtered. We've never been at war. Iruka stiffened, abruptly drawing the connection between the Hittite of these attackers and the Hittite that Naruto's mysterious mother wore. These are ninja from her village. Kushina-san's vague excuses for casting Naruto aside and never seeking him out until now never made any sense to me. This must be why she's come to Konoha not to see Naruto, but to use him as an excuse to scout the village for this attack. Yes, we have. An elderly kunoichi shrilled. Before Uzushiagaku no Sato existed we were at war. Your ignorance is no excuse, the old man continued. We will get justice. Quit your bellyachin', old man. Someone shouted and Iruka's head snapped to the right. Another group of foreign ninja, a trio, 2 of which looked like clones of each other, perched on the roof of the weapon storage shed. They were dressed similarly to the group with the werewolves, but none of them wore a Hittite. The twin ninja were clearly of the identical variety and neither of them did anything to differentiate himself from the other. They wore the same outfits, they possessed the same weapons, and they even wore their rusty orange hair in the same style. The third member of their group with his black hair and dark trench coat stood out all the more against their eerie sameness, but he looked enough like them to be a brother or a cousin. It was the man with the black hair that had spoken, and continued to speak. The people you really want to kill are long dead and dust. He sneered. Let it go and let the brats be. Uzumaki. The original spokes-ninja of the werewolf group spat. You dirty traitors. Why have you come? The old kunoichi hissed. There's no way you can stop what's coming, the old man added contemptuously. There are only 3 of you. Well, our sister is already here, and I'm sure she's having the time of her life kicking Oto ass, the dark-haired man shrugged. So you really ought to assume that there are 4 of us. But you know what they say about assuming things. His dark gray eyes swept down over the crowd of frozen, whimpering children and their tense Chunin instructors. Your school have a basement. You might want to herd the brats down there while we clean these vengeance nuts up. Uzumaki? Traitors? Sister? Irika blinked, struggling to make sense of it. Are they talking about Kushina-san? Are they really here to help? You really intend to try and stop us? The young leader of the werewolf handlers snorted derisively. Yeah, you and what army? Weren't you listening? One of the twins asked. About assuming. The other added. And I'm sure that these will help, the non-twin said almost cheerfully and held open his trench coat to reveal several knives. Are those silver? Irika frowned, narrowing his eyes at the bright sheen of the blades. Those won't do you any good. The young leader shouted. Some of the Chunin instructors started to try and herded the children back towards the classrooms, but it was much too late and Irika stood frozen as he watched several things happen almost simultaneously. The orange-haired twins took a knife in each hand from the dark-haired man's coat, as did he, and all 3 of them leapt from the roof to array themselves between the leading edge of the crowd of students and the foreigners seeking to harm them. Some of the foreigners raised metal wrist cuffs covered in mysterious seals, and then the docile, drooling wolf monsters were snapping, snarling berserkers, sprinting the short few feet towards the children. Young students started to scream, the Uzumaki raised their silver knives, the foreigners without the cuffs started to form hand seals. More black-clad ninja burst onto the scene, exploding from the trees and clearing the low wall that surrounded the academy grounds. Irika could tell they weren't Umbu, they had no masks. He couldn't get a count of them, his eyes were drawn to one in particular. He had 5 drawn swords, but none of them were in his hands. The blades were clutched by brick-red, furry tentacles, and the shining blades were shrouded in ghostly blue fire. Wah! Sarutobi Biawao sat grim-faced in the Umbu strategy room along with the other village elders, Mito Kato Homura and Yuta and Koharu. All around them low-level Umbu listened to radio reports and updated an enormous map of Konoha stretched over a table with the movements of allies and enemies. The Hokage's wife listened to the barely ordered chaos and considered all the fragmentary information as her husband was currently occupied. Crow and Eagle Tengu have been sighted in sectors 5 and 7. The spider demons are spreading to sector 11. Civilian evacuations are behind schedule in sectors 6, 4, 9, and 13. Werewolves are overrunning the forces in sector 8. Hokage-sama is still trapped in the stadium with Orochimaru. Squad 23 reports smoke from near the academy grounds. Jiraiya-sama has summoned one of his toads to combat the 2-headed snake in sector 2. Uzashionin now reported in sector 10. More Otonin sighted in sector 3. It won't be long until the fighting reaches the Hokage Tower complex, Homura muttered darkly. Civilian evacuations are behind schedule in all parts of the village and it's only getting worse, Koharu added sourly. Civilian and ninja casualties are climbing steadily. It's the Crow Tengu, Homura mused. They're flocked closest to the caves and they keep dive-bombing the civilians and their escorts while they're trying to evacuate. And we can't do much diverting of forces or the werewolves or spider demons will spread through the village unchecked, Koharu complained. We don't have enough Umbu field agents to go around, and all other ninja have the evacuations as a priority. Homura opened his mouth to continue pointing out new facets of their gloomy situation, but then he hesitated and flashed Biawao an irritated glance. Don't you have anything to say, Biawao-sama? Have you any insight into Hokage-sama's contingency plans? Koharu demanded. Biawao ignored them for the moment. Koharu and Homura had been teammates of her husband many years ago and they had survived to become village elders and trusted advisors. But in their old age they lost much of their senses of humor and could be difficult to deal with even on the best of days. So instead of answering them, she made up her mind on what she had been debating. The old woman stood up from her chair and strode over to the row of radio dispatchers who were busy urging other ninja to hurry and finish getting the civilians to safety so that Konoha could strike back properly. She selected one of the dispatchers and poked his shoulder to gain his attention. The young man jumped and did a double take when he turned. "I need to make an all-channel announcement," she informed him. He hesitated for a moment, then made some adjustments to his panel and abandoned his seat for her to take. Biawao settled into his chair, pulled the microphone closer, and pushed the button. "Cry wolf," she said, her words carried to every active Umbu radio. "I say again, cry wolf." Her announcement made, she returned the seat to its rightful owner and returned to sit among her fellow village elders. "What was that about?" Homura frowned, adjusting his glasses. "I activated our secret weapon," Biawao told them with a hint of a smirk. "And what would that be?" Kohara wanted to know. "You'll see," Biawao replied, finding a shadow of humor in the situation. "I'm sorry, Hiruzen. I know you wanted to wait a bit longer to unleash him. But no plan survives contact with the enemy and, the academy might be under threat. Since you're busy, it's my choice to make. Cry wolf. I say again, cry wolf." The words cut over all the other jumbled report tumbling in over the radio, and Mangetsu sighed deeply in relief. He stood up from the table in the quiet break room and adjusted his mask. With a deep focusing breath, he reached out to his seals and waited for the first summoning. Finally, when the Hokage's wife got on the radio, Tiger, leader of Squad 15, cringed. He hadn't expected for those particular code words to be announced, or the orders attached to them to be activated. No one in Umbu had. But they had been. "At least we'll get to use these kunai for something, if not their originally intended purpose." Tiger grunted and drew a tri-pronged kunai marked with seal paper and skidded to a halt at the edge of a roof. In the street below, a black-furred werewolf was clawing its way free of a doton cage another of his squad mates had cast. The wolf monster clearly had a broken back leg and a deep gash in its flank, but it seemed oblivious to any pain as it thrashed free of the earthen pen. Clenching his teeth, Tiger channeled chakra into the kunai and hurled it at the wolf's head, aiming for the eye. An Umbu that Tiger didn't recognize was perched on the beast's shoulder with the tri-prong kunai in his hands, and he drove the heavy blade into its neck, just behind the head, and twisted, severing the spine so severely that there was little chance that the werewolf's healing powers would save it. The black werewolf gurgled, blood oozed from its mouth, and it collapsed like a rag doll on the ruins of the stone cage. Tiger blinked. "What? Holy shit!" Someone shouted on the radio, breaking protocol. It worked. It actually worked. Tiger shook himself with a grimace and got moving again, seeking a new trouble spot or target. Several roofs away he caught up with Owl, his trap specialist. Owl gave him a brief nod as he finished crushing stone claws into the legs into an Otonin who seemed responsible for the werewolf which had just been killed. "So, he's back?" Owl asked, turning his avian mask towards the sky to check the location of the Tengu flock. "No," Tiger decided, slapping restraint seals on the Otonin, who was sliding swiftly into shock. If he survived, the interrogation squads would love to get a piece of him. Someone else must have uncovered the secrets of the Hiraishin no Jutsu. It was the only explanation, unlikely as it was. The Umbu he'd glimpsed killing the werewolf had been human, no pointed ears, no tail, no hint of fur or claws. Namikaze Minato had seen the full moon and turned. There was no coming back from that. "I guess Konoha has a new flash, and not a moment too soon." He was going home. Feet pattered over roofs and wings stroked the air as he bridged gaps formed by streets. Anarchy would help him. Nothing looked familiar, but he kept running because if he stopped, something bad would happen. His mother would make things right. Fire burned in his veins as he zigzagged in search of some magical landmark that would point the way. His father would know what to do. A shadow fell over him and he dodged left, stopped, turned back, caught the crow Tengu before it could climb back into the sky, and snapped its feathery neck. He was going home, and he would kill anything that got in his way. Kushina grimaced as she followed on Mikato's heels. When they'd reached the arena pit, Sasuke was nowhere to be seen. The proctor was also gone, so there hadn't been anyone to ask where the ex-Uchiha kid had gone. So Mikoto, seeing the demon tunnels open for the collection of Sasuke's dead demons, guessed that he'd gone that way. Therefore, they were going that way, down the tunnels and into the subterranean demon storage area. This place really stinks. When the hell did they last clean it? The corpses of the demons killed so far in the finals were stored down in the caverns under the arena, and they would remain there until the dead of night, when they would be carted out of Konoha for disposal. There were also the demons that were still alive, caged and waiting to be released and driven out into the sunlight for young demon hunting ninja to try and slay. The stench resulting from the waste of the living and the rotting dead was thoroughly pungent, even to an ordinary human nose. Kushina had to breathe through her mouth a lot to keep from retching. "I'm so glad I'm not one of the ninja stuck working down here." Mikoto dashed on through the dimly lit tunnels and chambers, oblivious to foul smells and demon growls as she sought any sign of her son. But no matter where they ran, they found no hint of Sasuke. The few demon tenders still down there hadn't seen any genin, and none of the captive demons were any help. They were too stupid to manage human language if they'd even cared to be helpful. But Mikoto wasn't discouraged, and she found one of the tunnels that led out of the stadium. They were used to get the live demons into the arena caverns before the finals, and later to move their corpses out afterwards. The exits came above ground several blocks away from the stadium and a few blocks shy of the village wall. It was a long trot, a good half of which was in total darkness, before they emerged into sunlight. The spot they'd arrived in was mostly warehouses and carpentry shops, and it would have been deserted anyway due to the finals and the unofficial holiday resulting from the competition. But with the muffled sounds of distant fighting drifting in from several directions, it was downright eerie. Kushina shivered a bit, but Mikoto didn't seem to care. Seeing no sign of the boy, they ascended to a warehouse roof to scout their surroundings. A column of smoke rose from just outside the distant stadium, and a few others were rising in other parts of the village. There was a giant pall of dust in another direction, the sign of at least two giant summons grappling with each other. And flocks of giant birds Tengu circled and dove over the heart of the village. "This really sucks," Kushina muttered. "I wonder where Minato's deployed. There's no way that he can sit this out and stay hidden." And naturally thoughts of Minato led to worries about Naruto. "I hope he's staying with the other genin. They should be safe if they stay down in that waiting area. This fight is way beyond all of them." But if she were in Naruto's place, she wouldn't sit idly by. With the arrogance of youth and the sense of immortality, she would have thrown herself into the fray once she decided who the bad guys were. She would be outraged by the jerks interrupting her test and hurting her friend's village, and eager to prove herself and display her chunin potential to allies. "Naruto's more cautious than I was," she told herself. Father made his lunar sword of Damocles painfully clear to him before casting him off. He's grown up under a worse cloud of fear than I ever did. He won't get into any fighting unless his genin compatriots start it first. I hope. "I don't see Sasuke anywhere," Mikoto said, a quiet note of anguish in her voice. "Neither do I," Kushina sighed. "I wish I paid attention to what he smelled like." "What do you think we should do?" Mikoto asked, wringing her hands as her drive faltered into uncertainty. Circle the stadium," Kushina suggested. "Maybe he left some other way? Someone surely saw him." "Well, hopefully." "Yes, that sounds." 10 Otonin surged up the sides of the warehouse with blades drawn. "Damn it!" Kushina snarled and charged the closest attacker, crushing his throat with her fist before he got his footing on the roof to stab her. Mikoto said nothing as he unleashed a multi-target Raiden that fried the 3 enemies nearest to her. The 2 women crashed into their foes more viciously than the Otonin had expected. Kushina ran through her vocabulary of curses as she crushed her enemies with her taijutsu skill. Mikoto never said a word as she cast chakra-fueled lightning to paralyze, burn, and kill, aided by the sharp perception of her spinning Sharingan. The 10 high-level chunin shinobi barely stood a chance. "Today sucks," Kushina declared as she kicked her final opponent off the roof with extreme prejudice. "I have to agree," Mikoto nodded as she relaxed her Sharingan to avoid unnecessary chakra drainage. "Let's get." The flat tar-coated roof suddenly collapsed under Kushina's feet and she fell into the warehouse below. In the skirmish, she and Mikoto had been separated and ended up on opposite corners of the roof, so the Uchiha woman was safe, but also unable to keep her friend from falling. The redhead tumbled off a pile of crates, bruising her side and knocking the wind from her lungs before she hit the packed earth floor hard. Before she could recover, violet lightning flashed over her, paralyzing her muscles and hazing her vision. "Don't struggle," a dark voice crooned as a shadowy figure loomed over her, silhouetted against the sunlight streaming down through the hole in the roof. "It's pointless." Forcing her eyes to refocus as she gasped for breath, the man's features slowly wavered into focus. His shaggy hair was a dark brown and his eyes were a pale icy blue. Recognition struck her harder than the demonic lightning. "Koshoku." Smirking, the Kitsune grabbed her by the hair and forced her to her feet, bracing her body against a pile of crates. "Remember how you threatened me?" He snarled softly into her ear. "How you said you'd out me to the Uchiha." Kushina tried to pull away, but his hand was tangled in her hair. Her muscles wouldn't obey her commands, and no matter how she gasped and gulped she couldn't seem to get enough air to say or do anything. "Well." He smirked and tore her crystal pendant from around her throat, dropped it, and ground it under the heel of his sandal. "Kushina!" Mikoto cried, dropping down the hole and landing on the top of the half-crushed crates and scanning the dark warehouse frantically. "Where are you?" "You can't out me," Koshoku whispered nastily as he pressed his free hand to her stomach, "if I out you first." She felt a tangle of his chakra slam into her system and she choked on a strangled scream as her throbbing body felt like it caught fire. "Bastard!" Chapter 53, Crazy Like a Fox. Mikoto shoved aside panic as she tried to scan the floor of the warehouse. Since the huge storage building was closed for the day, none of the lights were on, leaving the space illuminated only by the hole in the roof and a strip of small windows that circled the building, just under the roof edge. That left the canyons formed by the stacks of crates lost in deep shadows. And the vast space gave every sound an echo, which made trying to locate Kushina by her scream difficult at the very least. She must have gone this way, the Uchiha decided in an educated guess and bounded down from the crushed top of a crate stack to the packed earth floor. Her guess was off, but not by much. She didn't see Kushina where she landed, but a quick dash around the corner revealed her old friend. The redhead was backed up against the stack and the attacker had one fist entangled in her long hair and the other hand palm spread against her midriff. Mikoto's Sharingan spun faster and easily recognized the aggressor through the gloom. It was Byakuchi Koshoku, the Ozashionin who had been ejected from Konoha the day after her husband's sentencing. Her Sharingan noted the violent fluxes in Kushina's chakra. He wasn't locking her into a genjutsu. It looked like he was applying a seal to her. Drawing a kunai, Mikoto charged without a sound of warning. But either Koshoku somehow sensed her or finished whatever he was doing because he jumped backwards, abruptly releasing Kushina as he vanished down a different aisle. Mikoto hesitated to follow him. Kushina had crumpled to the ground and was wheezing and writhing in agony, and if Mikoto gave chase she would be defenseless. "Kushina, what did he do to you?" When the redhead failed to answer, Mikoto turned her question to the enemy shinobi. "Koshoku, what did you do to her?" "Nothing fatal," he assured her with a cold chuckle. His words echoed so badly it sounded like his voice could have come from anywhere. The echo was too extreme, it was a genjutsu, but since it was completely auditory her Sharingan couldn't protect her against it. "I'm actually doing you a favor, Uchiha. I'm showing you what your friend really is." Mikoto frowned, bit her lip, risked a glance back at Kushina was half curled into a ball on the ground, panting for breath and twitching almost like she was suffering a seizure. She was face down on the ground with her long hair hiding her face, but her left arm was in full view, and sprouting fur. Her nails were melting into black animal claws and her fingers were shrinking into stubby toes. Did Minato bite her? Was Mikoto's first thought. That seal that Koshoku used, is it meant to force a werewolf to transform without the stimulation of the full moon? No. No, that can't be right. Werewolf front paws are almost like hands, and that just looks like a dog's paw. Black pointed ears thrust up through Kushina's long, tangled hair. A bushy red tail with a white tip sprouted from the base of her spine and slipped out from under the long edge of her kimono-styled shirt. And then another tail, and then another, and then another, and 5. Mikoto gaped at the shuddering form, blade dangling loosely in her hand, as her heart thundered in her ears. 5 tails? I don't. The long red hair slowly shrank into red fur, revealing a much altered head. Instead of a round head with a flat face, there was an oval head with a long narrow muzzle. The eyes were the same dark blue-gray, but the pupils were cat-like slits, narrowed to black lines from discomfort and stress. The lips twitched and briefly peeled back to showcase a mouthful of sharp teeth in a grimace of pain. There was now a human-sized five-tailed fox laying there, wearing her friend's clothes. Kitsune. The word pounded around inside of her skull and she staggered back a step, dropping the kunai from nerveless fingers. It can't be. But it was. Her active Sharinon would have peered through any illusion. So it had to be true. So how does it feel? Koshoku asked in a gloating tone. How does it feel to know that your best friend is a Kitsune? Has always been a Kitsune? And you never knew? Never suspected? He laughed derisively. Tell me, Uchiha, how does it feel? Mikoto couldn't speak. The shock was too profound. Her mind screamed that it couldn't be true, but her Sharinon proved that it was. Koshoku was suddenly standing beside her. One arm was draped around her shoulders, the other pointed a short sword just underneath her chin. Mikoto could barely tear her eyes away from the creature on the ground to look into his glacier-cold gaze. How does your obscene Uchiha ego feel now? He sneered frostily. Does it hurt? Do you feel humiliated? Do you think yourself a failure? Is shame choking you alive? She couldn't answer him, even if she'd wanted to. You're boring, he complained with a sniff. I was hoping that you would prove to be more entertaining. Oh well, time to get rid of you so I can deal with this bitch a vixen. Koshoku adjusted his grip on his blade and raised the sharp edge to the skin of her neck. A white claw hand connected to a red-furred tentacle clamped onto Koshoku's face, twisted him to the side, and slammed him bodily into a wall of crates before detaching itself. You leave my friend alone. The fox was struggling to its feet and trying to kick the sandals off its back paws. Two of its tail tips flattened and compressed into blades and sliced off its sleeves at the shoulders so that the loose material wouldn't cause it to trip. But its primary focus seemed to be glaring holes into Koshoku as the man pushed off the crate he'd cracked with the impact of his shoulder. Your friend. Koshoku laughed uproariously. Now that she sees what you are, you still think you can call her your friend? You're crazy. I'll take that as a compliment. The fox retorted using Kushina's voice. Then it cracked one of its tails across his face and pounced upon him while he was still stunned by the swift blow. It pinned him down with all of its weight and snapped at his neck with its toothy jaws, tearing away a leather cord necklace. And then it pressed its right forepaw into Koshoku's gut and forced its chakra into him. Mikoto stood frozen, as if trapped in a waking nightmare, and watched as her Sharinon drew out her perception of time and burned every action, every movement permanently into her memory. Her spinning red eyes widened as Koshoku began to transform, just as Kushina had. Since he was laying on his back, she got an even better view of the process. She stared as his jaws and nose stretched outwards into a vulpine muzzle, and fur erupted from every patch of naked skin. Four foxtail exploded from the seat of his pants and lashed against the ground, kicking up small puffs of loose dust. This, too, was no illusion. He was a Kitsune, as well. There, how do you like a taste of your own medicine, huh? The red fox barked, stamping a black paw. Burns, doesn't it? Forced transformations are a real bitch. I'll get, Yuazu, Maki. He snarled between pants, his voice slightly distorted by his nearly complete transformation. No you won't, the red fox snorted. The vixen's 5 tails sharpened into spears and arched over her back to strike him like a scorpion. You lied to me, Mikoto breathed. The red fox paused and turned to peer over its shoulder at her curiously. The brown fox that had been Koshoku took advantage of the other's momentary distraction and lashed out first. He kicked one of his sandals off and hit the vixen on the nose, then used his 4 tails to sweep her legs out from under her. Then the brown Kitsune rolled to his feet and leapt upon her with teeth bared. Now that she'd finally managed to say something, Mikoto felt able to move again. And she took advantage of her return to mobility by darting back up the stack of boxes, gluing the soles of her feet to them with chakra. Then she exited the warehouse the same way that she'd entered, through the hole in the roof. Mikoto sprinted across the roof and jumped over to a neighboring warehouse where she took a moment to catch her breath. She lied to me. The Kitsune had never been her friend. That much was clear. The fox had probably sought to gain information on the Uchiha clan and saw Mikoto as a good source. Perhaps the demon had even hoped to corrupt her or use her as a pawn to disrupt or destroy the Uchiha. Mikoto squeezed her eyes shut against the dull throb of early Sherry-non strain. And one of the visiting foreigners was a genin, a kunoichi with long red hair and fierce-looking dark blue-gray eyes that narrowed critically when she learned that Mikoto was of the Uchiha. "I don't believe you," the strange girl declared. "She's too polite to be an Uchiha." Mikoto frowned at the Uzushio genin as she limped out of the arena in the forest of death after her successful match. "Why did you cheer for me?" the dark-haired teen demanded as she passed the foreigner on the way back to her team. "Why not?" the redhead shrugged with a cheerful grin. "Just because I'm from a different village doesn't mean I can't support the fighters that I like, does it?" She tried very hard not to laugh as the Uzushio liaison ninja scowled at her. "Are you serious?" "Yeah," Kushina grunted with a sour face. "I don't know crap about makeup. Could you please help me?" Mikoto fought down her amusement and nodded. The young Uchiha woman grimaced as the storm washed over her. "It's not fair." Kushina raged as she paced and made sharp, violent gestures with her hands. "They can't make you marry that creep. You deserve better." "Congratulations," Kushina said with a smile that was only half forced, and Mikoto wasn't sure if she was worried at her announcement or just shocked. "If it's a girl, will you name it after me?" "I don't understand," the redhead sniffled angrily as she flopped on Mikoto's couch while Mikoto paced the room with her whimpering firstborn. "I thought he liked me." "Minato likes everyone," the Uchiha mother sighed, rubbing baby Itachi's back. "Minato's a jerk." Kushina hissed. "Did you have a good night?" Mikoto asked, half irritated and half intrigued by all the odd comments that Kushina had been making all morning. "Oh, I did," Kushina practically purred. "Minato did, too." Mikoto sighed gratefully as she lowered her swollen frame down onto the bench beside the playground to watch Itachi play among the other children. Not too long after that, her old friend Kushina wandered over and joined her in uncharacteristic silence. After about 5 minutes of quiet fidgeting and staring out into space, she finally fielded Mikoto her question. "Hey." One hand tugged and twirled a lock of red hair and the other pressed against her flat stomach. "How'd you tell Fuyugaka that you were knocked up? What do you mean she went home?" Mikoto demanded, confused and anxious with her newborn baby, Sasuke, left at home in Itachi's temporary care. "She's in no condition to be traveling. She's pregnant." The Hokage looked very tired and very old. She could not be persuaded to stay. I think his sensei took him in," Mikoto gulped, hugging herself. "Well, that's good," the Uzumaki said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "I'd love to chat more, but I need to get going. I have a kid of my own to see." Mikoto was confused. "You know," Kushina said, tucking her takeout box under one arm and adjusting the straps of her bag. "Naruto, the boy your husband tried to murder in broad daylight." Mikoto turned ashen. I didn't." "Later. Do you think that when Naruto is better that I could meet him?" Mikoto inquired nervously. "I won't be offended if you say no. After what my husband did You're not Fuyugaku," Kushina snorted. "You're my friend. And I can't imagine you doing something bad enough to stop being my friend. So when Naruto is back to 100% we'll see about having a nice lunch with him or something." "Thank you." Mikoto vigorously shook her head and stared up into the bright blue sky, blinking back tears. With such a sky, it was hard to believe that Konoha was under attack, being invaded by enemies and monsters. But the beautiful sky lied. "She lied to me," she thought, and swallowed hard and dropped her gaze to her sandals. "We're not friends. We're..." "Ah, what a glorious day for conquest," a man declared from somewhere nearby. "Don't you think so?" Mikoto flinched and whirled to her right to find a stranger standing several yards away, gazing carelessly up at the clear heavens. He was rather handsome and young-looking with fine clothes in dark blue and black. His hair was an odd shade of dark blue and his eyes appeared to be a glowing shade of green. When he turned to flash a smirk at her, she spied a golden hoop earring attached to one earlobe. A Nuzashio Hitaiate hung around his neck, declaring his shinobi allegiance. "Who are you?" Mikoto demanded and reached for her kunai, but came up empty. The one kunai she'd brought with her from the stadium was still down in the warehouse with the Kitsune where she'd dropped it. She was now weaponless. "My name is Kurohi Udai," he replied as his smirk widened. "And judging by those spinning red eyes you are an Uchiha, yes." She nodded warily as she tried to sort through her unruly thoughts and decipher where she'd heard the name Kurohi before and what was so important about it. "Excellent." He beamed and removed something from around his neck. Then 6 navy blue foxtails emerged from his shadow and waved over his shoulders and around his ankles. "I was hoping to take an Uchiha trophy while I was here. Now the hard part will be finding the right sort of glass jar to keep those pretty eyes of yours in." Iruka stood near the front doors of the main academy building along with another of the Chunin instructors. They'd managed to herd the terrified students back inside with minimal injuries, and so far none of the children had been found to be missing. Now while all the other teachers tried to calm the students who were upset, Iruka and his comrade waited for the fighting to clear so that they could herd their charges to the cliff caves and safety. The sounds of battle were lessening, but Iruka didn't completely trust it. He wasn't sure what to believe now. Were they being saved from bloodthirsty invaders, or were they being stolen from one foe to be devoured by another? One side has werewolves, the other has demons, Iruka mused, thinking of the man with the furry tendrils that clutched 5 flaming swords. The side with werewolves want to deliberately infect the children so that Konoha is forced to mercy kill all of them. The side with the demons, what do they want? How many do they have? What sort of demons do they have? The one clear demon that Iruka had seen was an odd specimen. His glimpse of it had looked almost entirely human, a rare form among demons. That brought his mind to shapeshifters that were known to take human or human-like shape. Tanuki were the first thing that came to mind, but there was a polite knock on the door. "Hey, the way is clear. You should hurry up and go." Iruka hesitated before cracking open the door. The speaker was the dark-haired shinobi that had argued with the Uzashionin with the werewolves. Over his shoulder Iruka could see a werewolf carcass and other signs of battle, but no more fighting. "Who are you?" Iruka demanded, opening the door a touch wider. "Why should we trust you?" "Uzumaki Arashi," the stranger replied. "And I don't really care whether you trust us or not. My father ordered me to stop any attack on the ninja school and clear the way for kids to escape, and that's what I and my buddies have done. Stay here and wait, or leave for someplace else. It makes no difference to me." Iruka bristled. "You don't care about what happens to innocent children. Ignore our brother," one of the orange-haired twins sighed, striding into view from the left. "He's a bitter soul," the other twin added, just one step behind his twin. "Of course I am," Arashi snorted. "We're here risking our skins for demon hunters that would gladly slit our throats if they knew what we were and hoping that our helpful actions will earn us mercy." "You sound like a Kurohi," one of the twins observed with disapproval. "Perhaps you should put on your Uzashio Hitaiate and go join them," the other said with a frown. "They'd skin me alive for being an Uzumaki or sell me to Orochimaru," Arashi grunted. "No thanks." "What are you?" Iruka asked, struggling to hide a surge of nerves. "They're all demons?" "Kitsune," Arashi answered. "You know, evil shape-shifting foxes that live and breathe lies and deceit, and are always plotting against mankind, and worship the monstrous Nine Tails like a god." His words oozed sarcasm. "That's what you know of us, and it must be true because you know everything there is to know about demons." Both the twins slapped the back of their black-haired brother's head. "Shut up!" they snapped in eerie unison. "See what we mean," one said. "He's a bitter soul," the other finished. "Jerks," Arashi muttered, rubbing the back of his skull. "Anyway," he told Iruka, "we're moving on, so do what you want." "I'll go tell the others," Iruka's Chunin comrade whispered and retreated back to the classrooms. Is Uzumaki Kushina a Kitsune, too?" Iruka asked, before the foxmen could depart. "Of course," Arashi replied. "She's our little sister." You know our sister? One twin asked. Are you a friend? The other inquired. I'm Naruto's friend, Iruka answered. Not your sister's. What? That's here. Arashi blinked. You do know that's half werewolf, right? Aren't you supposed to kill those things so they don't spread their disease? Iruka recoiled a step, shocked at the man's callous attitude towards his own nephew. So what if he's here? A new voice scoffed. The twins withdrew, revealing the demon that had held the flaming swords. If he's welcome here, he's not our problem, and Kushina-chan will be delighted. The red-haired demon man sheathed the last of his 5 swords and wrapped one of his 5 fox tails around Arashi's bicep to drag him away. No more, we should have killed him instead of exiling him, talk. Especially not where she can hear you. Unless you want her to break your jaw, again. Iruka stared after the demons in human form as they withdrew. Perhaps Kushina-san's vague excuse of family trouble wasn't a lie after all. Naruto wanted to exercise his vocabulary of swears, but he didn't have the breath to waste on it. He and Shino and Shikamaru had circled the outside of the stadium twice in search of the transformed Sasuke, but had come up empty. So far they'd been fortunate enough to avoid running into any enemy forces, but there was no telling how much longer their luck would last. Troublesome, Shikamaru panted. We might as well give up. He could be anywhere by now. No way. Naruto snapped, flexing his fingers as they sprouted claws. Somebody might mistake him for a monster and try to kill him. Why does he matter to you? Shino inquired curiously. His clan has sought your life once already. Sasuke is no part of them anymore, Naruto argued. He's just like me now, cursed and cast out for what he is. If I were in his place, I'd want someone to come and help me. Wouldn't you? Shino gave a slow, slight nod, while Shikamaru just grunted as he flopped down on the roof they were standing on to catch his breath. Naruto clenched his pointed teeth and scampered over to a neighboring roof and up a small clock tower to get a better view of his surroundings. He allowed himself to change a bit more, shifting his ears to hear better, enhancing his nose so he could smell better, and squinting his fox eyes so that he could see better. He'd set out to catch and subdue Sasuke so that the ex-Uchiha would be safe, and he refused to fail his self-appointed mission. Come on, where are you, Sasuke? In one direction he saw a boiling cloud of Tengu. In another he saw several columns of smoke. Another area looked like it was draped in spider webs. And near the trees a dark gray dot fluttering low over the rooftops. Over there. Naruto pointed. That's gotta be him. Without waiting for the other 2 genins' opinions, Naruto took off, scrambling on all fours to get an extra bit of speed. It could be tricky to follow him into the trees, but at least he's not running towards the Uchiha district. Mangetsu grimly flickered from summoning to summoning, dispatching death and destruction at every stop. He shattered Tengu in midair, slit the throats of startled Otonin, disemboweled hulking spider demons, and destroying the spines of werewolves. Killing the lycanthropes was the worst. They were clearly under some external control, and even if they weren't, they were just humans trapped within an ugly, violent curse. The werewolves were as much victims as they were villains. He shoved aside his sorrow at their deaths for later. There was no way to try and save them in the midst of this nightmarish battle. If he tried, he would not only risk injury to himself, but leave the ninjas he was supporting in danger. So he sought to kill them as quickly and mercifully as he could. I'm sorry. He drove a trikine deep into a brown werewolf's neck between the base of its skull and its seal-stamped metal collar and twisted, mangling the spinal cord and displacing vertebrae. I'm so sorry. Flash. An eagle Tengu. Flash. An Otonin. Flash. A crow Tengu. Flash. An Uzashionin. Flash. A werewolf. He hoped that the Umbu hurling his knives were aiming carefully. If the kunai missed and flew towards an ally instead, he would kill that ally before he had time to realize what he'd done. That was the difficulty in using his jutsu like this. If his assistants weren't careful, he could be just as dangerous to his own side as he was to the enemy. A brief lull in summonings came and he flashed to a rooftop in a quiet sector and knelt to catch his breath. While he crouched there, he checked himself for injuries. His speed didn't always protect him, and with his flashing to every part of the village he couldn't really protect himself from enemies he wasn't attacking. To heal, he just shifted towards Wolf. So far he was halfway transformed and soon he'd have to take his mask off as it wouldn't fit over his wolf muzzle. With how briefly he was in any one place, his being a werewolf shouldn't really be a problem. And the only ninja he was really concerned with were the Uchiha, and he really didn't see them as much of a danger. To kill me they'd have to catch me, and not even the strongest Sharingan can trace the high ration. Chapter 54, Return of the Kitsune. The battle in the heart of the stadium had ground down into a stalemate. The invaders were clustered on one side of the arena pit. Konoha's defenders stood on the other. Both groups stared each other down, seeking some weakness in the other, some advantage over the other, and neither found one. Kakashi pressed his lips together behind his mask and wondered just how he'd ended up the leader of Konoha's forces in this area. He appeared strong and unbothered by the situation, but it was all just a front. Obito's Sharingan had almost completely drained him, despite the fact that he'd minimized his ninjutsu use and depended primarily on taijutsu and his store of kunai. Another 10 minutes of fighting, and he'd collapse. The enemy was unaware of this fact, and Kakashi was sure to give no outward hint of his weariness so they would stay unaware. With the active fighting at a standstill, adult genin and low-level chunin had slipped into the stadium. One section at a time they awakened the genjutsu-trapped civilian spectators and herded them to evacuation routes and safety. At least a third of the audience had been moved from harm's way, and so long as Kakashi's forces could keep the enemy from acting, civilians would continue to escape. Once the stadium was empty of non-combatants, the ninja who had put themselves under Kakashi's command would be free to attack the invaders without fear and with all the destructive jutsu they'd avoided out of concern for collateral damage. I wish I could read my book, he thought morosely as he ignored a wave of fatigue. Unable to pull out his beloved book, the Jonin studied his opponents while doing his best to feed as little chakra as possible to Obito's eye. Most of the enemy were Otonin, an almost entirely male force garbed in camouflage patterns and shades of violet and gray. The minority of Konoha's enemies were Uzishionin. Kushina-san did mention that there were tensions in her home village a time or two. But I thought that she meant family or clan troubles. This is clearly a more serious problem than I realized. While the Otonin were of dubious to moderate quality as fighters, the Uzishio ninja were clearly the superior foe. If there had been more than a handful of them, Konoha's defenders would be in a much tighter spot. Perhaps the Uzishionin could have even won this battle for the enemy if they'd come in enough force. However, Konoha had been fortunate. There were only a dozen Uzishionin spread throughout a large host of Otonin of inferior quality. And the enemy forces seemed leaderless, with Orochimaru locked away behind that barrier on the roof with the Hokage. With no field leader to spur the invaders to action, the stalemate seemed likely to continue until the clash on the roof was decided. Hopefully Hokage-sama will triumph. Kakashi shifted slightly and adjusted his grip on the kunai that had drawn at the start of the standoff. Without Orochimaru to drive or inspire his forces, this invasion will collapse. Or, at least the human element of it will. That would cut down on the number of enemies all over the village and... Look up there, Kurenai said quietly from a position somewhere behind Kakashi's left shoulder. The stands directly behind the clustered enemy had been evacuated first, leaving a barren safe zone of empty seats. On top of the wall that loomed over the abandoned part of the nosebleed section, some kind of creature had appeared. And as Kakashi took notice of it, several other appeared to join it more every minute. Bracing himself, Kakashi strained Obito's Sharingan to identify the newcomers. Foxes. More than 24 of them. Most were rather ordinary in coloration, but a few were decidedly exotic. Some wore clothing while others wore nothing but their fur. All of them had 2 tails or more. Kitsune. Kakashi wavered a bit, lightheaded from the strain of boosting the Sharingan, and he opened his mouth to warn. The small horde of demon foxes darted into motion, spilling down into the stadium towards the arena pit. The demons split into 3 branches as they charged, one that went left, one that went to the right, and a few that kept moving straight. In seconds the monsters swept down onto the enemy, striking their flanks and rear simultaneously. The Konoha ninja were left untouched and ignored. What do you think? Genma asked, his voice barely audible over the sudden roar of renewed combat across the arena. Do we pick some of them off, or hold back until one side wins. We hold off, Kakashi decided as he observed a dark green fox with 4 tails slash up an otonin with its tails while it went for another's throat with its teeth. Someone go find some food pills while we wait. Taking a risk to preserve his strength, Kakashi raised his hand to his Hitaiate to cover Obito's eye. A silver Kitsune charged one of the Uzashionin, and the ninja retaliated by sprouting 3 fox tails of his own and trying to strangle the demon. Kakashi's eyes darted over the melee and every Uzashio fighter had done the same. 2 of them were even in the process of fully transforming into more Kitsune. Interesting, Kakashi muttered. I suppose this explains Naruto. He slipped his weaponless hand into his kunai pouch and a finger caressed the spine of his book. I wonder if Minato-sensei knew. At the sounds of fresh combat, Kabuto looked up and adjusted his glasses. He expected to see Orochimaru's forces exchanging blows with Konoha's fighters. What he saw instead raised both his eyebrows. Kitsune? Fascinating. The genin wasted another minute on watching the surprising fight before returning to his duties. Seeing his Konoha Hitaiate, other genin and chunin assumed he was one of them and he'd been drafted into the forces that were evacuating civilians from the stadium. Kabuto greatly enjoyed the irony of releasing Leaf citizens from the genjutsu that he'd cast on them with no one any the wiser. Things aren't going to plan. He briefly glanced up at the square barrier up on the roof that contained the Hokage and Orochimaru. He's been in there too long. Orochimaru might lose. If he loses, I think I'll leave. Kushina was in a thoroughly bad mood. The final trial had been interrupted. Orochimaru, his goons, and Udai's vengeance-hungry rabble had attacked. Sasuke was missing and she didn't know for sure if Naruto was in a safe place. And now Kashoka had reappeared, forced her transformation, messed with Mikato's head, and he was currently trying to rip out her throat. Well, she'd started the throat-ripping out attempts, but considering all the stuff that had led to her actions, she felt perfectly justified in her murderous aim. At first glance, she held the clear advantage. He had 4 tails, while she had 5. Every all-out physical assault he launched at her, she could neutralize. And when she went after him, she always had 1 tail that he couldn't block. On top of that, the very fact that she had 1 more tail than he did meant that she had a significantly larger reserve of chakra. But he was older than she was, giving him more than a decade of experience over her. And his Kitsuneba was the recessive manifestation, violet lightning instead of blue fire. The electric attacks numbed and paralyzed and made it very risky for her to enter into close combat with him. So what she started as a tooth and claw brawl quickly evolved into a long-distance slugging match with fire, lightning, and hurled bits of crates and merchandise. Kushina growled as she ducked under yet another orb of violet electricity that Kashoka had hurled at her, and then she used 3 of her tails to pick up a half-smashed crate to toss it at him. The brown fox leapt aside and vanished down one of the many aisles formed by the towering stacks of goods stored in the warehouse. Snapping her jaws in frustration, she followed him at a cautious trot, all her sharp senses at full alert. With the dim lighting, smoke, and dust from their fighting, and the very restricted field of view created by the maze of wooden boxes stacked near the rafters, the warehouse was a tricky and dangerous place to fight. Her foe could vanish down the aisle and lay an ambush or circle around her to strike from an unexpected direction. He could even scale some of the stacks and attack her from above. The place favored defense and he was defending himself from her attacks. Perhaps if I goaded him into attacking me. Bounding up the nearest stack, she crouched at the top and turned in tight circles to try and keep track of all directions of possible attack. "What's your angle?" she demanded. "What's got you up in arms against humans? There's no way you're old enough to have survived the slaughter. Unless you're so vain that you won't let even a hint of your true age to show on your human face." "I'm as old as I look," he chuckled darkly, and she cursed internally. Damn, he's cloaked his voice. I can't get any fix on his location that way. And as for my motivation, he continued, it's none of your business. And really, do I need a reason? They're beasts. They breed like vermin, they barely live longer than insects, and they spread over the land like a plague. They slaughter innocent demons along with the destructive ones and make no effort to discriminate between the two. They deserve to die. They need to die. Bullshit. Kushina fired back. They're people like you and I, and there are just as many decent ones as there are monstrous ones. You're mad, Koshoku's voice sneered from everywhere and nowhere. You're completely insane. Even if humans weren't a disgusting disease, they'll die long before you will. Why befriend things that'll die off like mosquitoes when you will last for centuries? That's the price we pay for long lives, she shrugged, straining her eyes against the gloom in search of movement below. We linger on while the world changes all around us with only memories of ghosts for company. How poetic, he mocked. And like all poetry, it's mindless drivel. Spoken like a true barbarian, she retorted, sitting on a spike of anger. That's all Byakuchi are, bloodthirsty barbarians without the brains to do anything but kill, and when you can't do that, you bitch and moan like spoiled puppies. This would be a case of the kettle calling the pot black, Koshoku responded. The Uzumaki are warriors just like the Byakuchi. You aren't scholars, you're killers. The only thing that sets us apart is that your clan possesses a Kekai Genkai, the Kyuzeri no Tenko, the chains of the celestial fox. Without that fancy power with its pretty name, you're no different than the Byakuchi, or the Retsukai or the Kurikawa. My poor brother Kenshin got roped into marrying a Byakuchi vixen, Kushina plowed on. All she does is bitch and moan like she's supposed to be the center of the universe and the world should revolve around her. She's totally incapable of doing anything else that might be useful and everybody hates her. I bet you and her are first cousins. You totally remind me of Suzume. If you're trying to gain advantage over me by making me angry, you're doing a terrible job, the brown fox snorted. Bolts of violet lightning exploded up from the dark aisle and crawled up the left side of the crate stack, leaving scorch marks and splintered wood as it rose. Kushina leapt to a neighboring tower of crates. The wooden boards under her paws exploded, sending her tumbling down onto the hard-packed dirt floor. Ears ringing from the bomb, she shook her head and struggled to get her bearings. He seemed to materialize out of the shadows and pounced on her back, snapping his jaws on the back of her neck to sever her spine. And he found himself biting a crate full of porcelain plates. 2 stacks away, Kushina huddled in the space where the crate she's swapped places with had been and caught her breath. She wasn't much of a genjutsu user, but she did know a few basic tricks and hiding the source of her voice was one of them. With all the adrenaline humming through her system, it was even harder than usual for her to subtly weave her chakra the way that she needed to, but she persevered. Clever, she snarled. Use Kitsune to drive me onto a crate you hit an explosive note on. Well, how do you like the taste of that box? At least you're capable of learning, Koshoku said, his voice's location still hidden. Now the hunt will actually be a challenge. Bastard. Kushina seethed, but forced herself to not react. He wanted her to try and attack him, or at least give her position away. Damn, he's good at this. This fight is taking too long. I'm wasting energy. I need to end this, and fast. The question is how. She gouged little furrows in the earthen floor with the claws of her right forepaw while her mind raced and her senses sought any sign of Koshoku sneaking up on her. It's the terrain that's the trouble. I can't win in here, not quickly enough. I should sneak out of here, let him waste his time looking for me while I go do something productive. Maybe I should set some fires so that the place burns down. I shouldn't have to pay for all the crap in here that gets ruined. Probably. Ah, screw it. I'll. The roof a few yards to her right cracked and bowed downward, as if Chowza had grown himself into a giant and lightly punched it. What the hell? Then it happened again, this time 10 yards to her left, and the roof cracked open allowing sunlight to pour through. Someone else must be fighting up there, I wonder who? She bunched her tails around her paws. An ally of mine? Or his? The third time it happened, a ragged circle of the roof vaporized into slivers and dust. This could be just the distraction I need. Mikoto stumbled with fatigue as she dodged an enormous bolt of demonic lightning that left an enormous hole in the roof. The gash on her left arm ached and her eyes burned with the strain of keeping her Sherry non-active longer than she had in years. But she forced herself to keep focus and keep moving. If she didn't keep ahead of the demon, he'd obliterate her. The Rokubai Kitsune was relentless in his pursuit. He'd chased her almost gleefully in circles over dozens of warehouse roofs, nipping at her heels with electricity in his 6 sinuous tails. Now that her lungs were burning and her control over her Sharingan was wavering, he was increasing the destructiveness of his attacks. He's definitely an A-rank demon, maybe even S-rank. She'd tried to fight back early on, with no real success. Her Raiden attacks only seemed to irritate him. He'd laughed when she'd tried to trap him in a genjutsu, and taijutsu was out of the question. When she'd tried to close and launch a physical assault, his six tails would stab at her like spears, all at different speeds and angles. Her Sharingan would try to track all of them and predict what they'd do so she could avoid them, and while she was distracted he'd suddenly throw a punch or a kick at her. That was what had happened to her arm. She'd gotten too close in a bid to apply a more direct and powerful Raiden to him, but he'd managed to surprise her with a blow to her jaw. Before she could recover her wits and retreat to a safe distance, one of his tails shaped into a sharp blade had sliced into her forearm. "I'm not dressed for this. I don't have any of my weapons. I'm tired and I'm starting to run low on chakra. I need help." Mikoto faked a move left, then dove right to avoid another blast of sizzling energy. Her wounded arm dragged against the rough roofing material as she tucked and rolled, and she swallowed a gasp of agony. When she tried to stand, her foot slipped on a distorted section of roof and fell hard. Her left ankle twisted until there was a crunch. Gray mist hazed the edges of her vision as her mouth opened in a silent scream of surprised pain. But her Sharingan stayed active somehow, and as she collapsed onto her side and clutched at her leg, she saw her death coming in slow motion. She couldn't help but see every minute detail of the demon Udai as he leapt upwards to drop on her like a stooping hawk, his six tails curved around his body like deadly rays of the sun. Triumph blazed in his green-slit pupil eyes as he bared his sharp teeth in victory. The look of shock that spread over the fox-tailed man's features was almost comical when Kushina's fox form crashed into his side, knocking him aside and tumbling him head over tails halfway across the warehouse roof. "What?" Mikoto blinked her watering eyes, and when they opened again, the red vixen crouched before her, interposing her body between the collapsed Uchiha and the partly transformed Kitsune. Her 5 tails lashed like an angry cat's and her spine was arched. Even though her head was turned away from Mikoto, the woman was certain that she was snarling like an angry beast. "Ah, Kushina, there you are." Udai laughed as he slowly righted himself. "I was wondering when I would run into you." "Udai." The vixen spat the name like a curse. "I was wondering if you'd show your face here." "Hoping to see me?" He purred as dark blue and black fur started to sprout from his pale skin. "What a pleasant surprise. Have you changed your mind about offering yourself to me as a mate?" "Hell no." She barked. "The only reason I want to see you is to kill you." "Oh well." Udai speed his transformation along and shed his long, flowing coat to reveal the simple, sleeveless outfit he wore underneath. "Since you've disappointed me," he said as he finished and stepped out of his human shoes, "I'm going to have to disappoint you." "You won't kill me, I'll kill you." Hinata couldn't stop the trembling of her fingers or the wobbly feeling in her knees as she tried to strike an aggressive posture at Tenten's side. They'd made it to her relative's weapon shop and gotten armed without too much trouble. But now they were trapped by the enemy, unable to help the village at large. The enemy was a single ninja, a pale teenage boy older than all of them, but not yet an adult. He was almost colorless except for a few red markings around his eyes, and the way he wheezed and coughed hinted that he was sickly. And the fact that he was ill was probably the only thing that had kept him from killing them all yet. He had a Kekai Genkai, a very powerful one that he was very good at using. The teen was able to grow bones both to defend himself and to use as weapons. He'd grown some bone plates underneath his skin to protect himself against Tenten's blades, and he sprouted sharp spars and blades of bone to hurt Lee, Kiba, Akamaru, and Chuji when the boys tried to attack him. Ino had made one attempt to possess the sickly Otonin, but either by luck or on purpose he'd dodged her disembodied soul and he'd almost managed to stab her body before she could recover. Sakura hadn't tried to attack him yet and instead had hung back and was studying the problem while she fiddled with some kunai. Hinata had tried her luck against him either. She didn't think she should try until she managed to focus her Byakugan so that she could see his skeleton and track what his bones were doing. "I wish Nejina-san was here," she fretted. "He'd be able to compensate much faster. And Tenten-san and Lee-san are his teammates. Together with them he would surely triumph." But Neji wasn't here. Hinata had no idea where he was. She hoped that he was alright, but a part of her mind couldn't help but imagine all the horrible things that might have happened to him. I wish Kurenye-sensei was here. Hinata flinched as she watched Kiba get stabbed in the shoulder by a bone blade while the Otonin destroyed Akamaru's false Kiba form with another blade jutting out of the elbow of his other arm. With her genjutsu, we could win. None of us can craft illusions like she can. But she wasn't here. And Neji wasn't here. They, the bits and pieces of 4 different genin teams, were the only ones here, and they had to do the best they could. If they didn't, no one would save them. All right, Sakura muttered as Lee pulled Kiba off the bone that had impaled his shoulder and dragged him to safety while Akamaru took cover behind a nearby utility pole. Let's see if this does it. Hinata watched through her active Byakugan as the pink-haired Kunoichi started hurling a dozen of kunai at the bone wielder. There were small pouches tied to the ring ends of the throwing blades that burst as the teen knocked the weapons aside with his unnaturally hard bone blades. The air around him quickly filled with tiny scraps of paper barely larger than stamps that fluttered around like flower petals, or snow. Then Sakura flung the last kunai, which trailed a short fused exploding tag. Boom. The explosion was much stronger than Hinata had anticipated, and their entire group was knocked off their feet. Windows a block and a half in every direction shattered. And the enemy was lost in a pall of smoke. Did it work? Ino asked, her voice sounding odd around the ringing in Hinata's ears. Did Forward get him? I hope so, Tenten panted as she fingered a fresh storage scroll loaded with throwing weapons. Nice use of stamp bombs. Thank you, Sakura sighed. Those were hard to put together. Chuji said something, but Hinata didn't hear him. Her Byakugan had deactivated when she'd been knocked over by the blast, but as she regained control she could see through the smoke. Their fight wasn't over. The ghoulish teen was still standing. Before Hinata could find her voice and warn them, a breeze cleared the air and they saw for themselves. He was badly burned, and in a few places his white skin had been torn away from the bone armor he'd formed underneath it to protect himself. The young man wavered, but kept his feet. And then odd angular black lines started appearing on his skin as if invisible ink brushes were drawing them, and he charged at them. The ground shook violently and a fissure opened up just in front of the Otonin, causing him to stumble and come to a halt. Before the shaking had stopped, a handful of senbon needles flew in from a side street and struck him. They didn't penetrate very deep because of the bone plates and they fell out in seconds, but the skin they'd touched turned red and swollen. Poison. Hinata blinked and adjusted the focus of her Byakugan to see who had come to their aid. Her vision peered through the shops that formed the corner to their left and saw 2 youthful-looking women, and a pet pig. One of the women was slender with dark-colored hair and some sort of metal contraption mounted on her wrist. The other had light hair tied into 2 loose ponytails and possessed some impressively large breasts. And the pig had a little coat and a pearl necklace. I wonder how much calcium you need to take in on a daily basis to stay healthy, the fair-haired woman drawled, her words loud enough for Hinata and her group to hear clearly. Who is that? Ino frowned. Can you see, Hinata? Tenten asked. I don't know, Hinata squeaked. I've never seen. The Otonin didn't answer the newcomer, he just raised his hands towards both new women and fired the bones from the tips of his fingers at them. Hinata gasped, but both women managed to avoid serious hits. One bone bit grazed the dark-haired woman's shoulder, and another ruffled the fair-haired woman's hair. And then the big-bosomed woman retaliated by stomping her foot, and making the ground shake again, and the fissure widen. She did that? Hinata gaped. Just by stomping her foot once? While the Otonin was briefly unbalanced, the dark-haired woman raised the odd device on her wrist, pulled a wire, and it fired more senbon needles. This time the weapons hit him in the stomach. Again they didn't penetrate very deep, but they distracted him just long enough for the pony-tailed woman to charge him and punch the ground. Now in the intersection, all the genin could watch as the street buckled and cratered. The pavement cracked like an eggshell and the shockwaves from her blow forced some bits to sink while others rose up like flat-topped spikes. The quivering, uneven ground managed to unbalance the Oto-teen and force him down on one knee. And then the blonde woman stood, took 3 steps, and slammed her fist into the pale teenager's jaw before he could bring his bone spike-encrusted forearms up to block, which sent him flying backwards down the street and out of their sight. But Hinata could still see, a few shops were no real barrier to her sight. Their enemy bounced a few times like a rag doll before sliding to a halt. Her strike had been so powerful that not even his bones could survive it. His jaw and neck were broken in several places, and he was quite dead. "Thanks, Shizune," the blonde woman said as she dusted her hands off. That poison slowed his reaction time just enough. "You're welcome, Tsunade-sama," the dark-haired woman replied happily as she and the pig hurried over to her side. "Tsunade-sama." Tenten breathed, her brown eyes shining with awe. "Tsunade-sama's here." Hinata deactivated her Byakugan so she didn't have to see the dead teenager anymore and glanced at Tenten oddly. Tenten-san usually only looks like that when she's admiring a weapon. The busty blonde turned and looked in their direction and frowned. "What are you genin doing here? Shouldn't you be guarding the civilians in the caves?" "Tsunade-sama." Tenten moved so quickly she might have teleported in front of the woman to bow. "Please teach me the secret of your awesome strength. It is my dream to become a kunoichi as powerful and respected as you." The blonde woman looked at Tenten's adoring face and rubbed at the odd purple mark on her forehead like she was getting a headache. "When I find that old woman that tricked me into coming back here, I'm going to pulverize her." The legendary ninja hissed. Hinata froze mid-fidget in confusion. "What old woman?" Chapter 55, Unleashed. Kushina tensed and charged at Yudai, intent on hitting him before he was finished transforming. If she hit him while his joints and skull were stuck in between forms, he would be significantly impaired and unable to effectively defend himself. It was a very narrow window of opportunity, and if she missed it she was probably screwed. All the advantages that she'd had over Koshoku, Yudai had over her. He had 6 tails to her 5, which gave him one more dangerous appendage than she and all the energy reserves that came with it. And worse, he was a few years older than her, giving him a slight edge in experience, too. So, she needed to move fast and rip out his throat before he could. Something snagged her left hind leg and yanked her off course, swinging her aside with enough force to almost dislocate her hip. Kushina let out an involuntary yelp and bounced and rolled a few times before coming to a halt. As she surged back to her paws, she choked on a curse as she caught sight of the one who had thwarted her desperate attack. "Damn you, Koshoku." The brown fox had caught on to her escape much faster than she'd hoped that he would. He must have heard her snarling at Yudai and saw no reason not to butt in. And now the odds of her winning this fight went from slim to abysmal. "I should have just grabbed Mikoto and run." She castigated herself while she split her glare between the two males. "But no, I just had to pick a fight with Yudai. I just had to kill his sorry ass." "What, I wasn't a good enough opponent for you?" the brown fox demanded mockingly. "A Yonbi isn't a big enough challenge? You need to jump straight up to a Rokubai." "Shut your yap, cur." Kushina snarled. "Urarg." Yudai now wore the sleek form of a navy blue fox with 6 bristling tails instead of a man, and he was on her like a flash. His jaws closed on the scruff of her neck and his chest pressed down on her back, nearly forcing her forelegs to collapse with his sudden weight. He wasn't biting her neck to break it, all he had between his teeth was fur and loose skin, but he'd clamped down hard enough to draw blood and cause pain. Automatically her tails struck at his back, but Koshoku had gleefully interfered, pinning 4 of her tails with his, and immobilizing the 5th with his teeth. She tried to buck free, but Yudai wound 2 of his tails around her back legs and Koshoku gave her a painful zap of electric Kitsune to lock up her muscles. She was trapped with no Kawarimi escape nor any hope of help nearby. Her numb legs gave out and Yudai shifted over her prone form and his free tails started to slowly slice away her human clothes, bit by bit. "Be bastard!" She choked out around clenched teeth as panic tried to close her throat. "He's not going to." Something sharp and metallic clattered to the roof as her top shredded. Koshoku howled in shocked pain and the air filled with the stench of burning fur. His grip on her tails vanished and the brown fox started desperately rolling around, putting out the flames that had sparked on his back. Mentally kicking herself, she grabbed a hold of inspiration and channeled her chakra into blue flame over the entirety of her body, forcing Yudai to release her and leap free with a very undignified yelp. They both have the recessive type of Kitsune. That means that electricity doesn't bother them. They could shove a tail into a light socket and just feel a little tingle. But that leaves them vulnerable to fire, and the dominant manifestation of Kitsune. "I can't believe I forgot about that," It was a stupid mistake to make. Kitsune were extremely resistant to whatever element their Kitsunebe took. It would be very silly for a fox demon to electrocute itself or set itself on fire when it was trying to use its inborn power. But they were only resistant to the element their Kitsunebe was, which meant that since her form was fire, she wasn't bothered by fire but she could be stunned by electricity, and since her current enemy's form was electricity they were immune to Raiden attacks but she could set them on fire. I need to try and train more often with Kitsune with electric Kitsunebe so I don't make this dumb mistake again. Now free, Kushina labored to her paws again, snapped up the dropped weapon in her jaws, and staggered away from the males as the last shreds of her clothing dropped off her body in smoldering bits of ash. Her legs didn't work quite right. Koshoku's Kitsunebe still had her muscles stiff so her limbs didn't want to bend and felt numb. But she got away from the two singed Kitsune and put herself between them and the hobbled Mikoto. You set yourself on fire, and you aren't even singed? The Uchiha asked, her tone pained and incredulous. Yep, Kushina muttered as she passed the paper-wrapped kunai to one of her tails. That's how I ruined my clothes that one time a couple of weeks back when you caught me coming back in the morning. I was in a hurry to change so I just roasted em off. She wrinkled her nose. Now I have to buy more, damn it. You bitch. Yudai roared, brushing angrily at the charred fur on his chest and belly. You'll pay for that. Koshoku was even more furious than Yudai. He was more severely burned and one of his tails was almost naked from having all the fluffy fur charred off. I'll teach you to set me on fire, Uchiha harlot. The brown Yanba bellowed. No you won't, Kushina scoffed. You bastards are already dead. And then her primary tail snapped like a catapult, flinging the kunai it had curled around like a missile. The blade was a silver and white blur as it whizzed low between the two enemy foxes and lodged point down into the flat roof several feet beyond their positions. Both males looked over their shoulders at it and when they saw that the paper wrapped around the handle wasn't an exploding tag or letter bomb, they both laughed and turned back to face her. Your funny kunai missed, Yudai sneered. So, you were saying. The blue fox didn't see the golden werewolf in the torn black bodysuit and blood-spattered white umbu armor appear beside the kunai. Yudai reared backwards and twisted sideways when the wolf's clawed hand slapped the side of his head. One of the werewolf's claws caught on Yudai's piratical golden hoop earring and tore it from the Kitsune's triangular ear, leaving a bloody tear as he staggered away with a yip that sounded like a shriek. Koshoku never saw him at all. The brown fox's neck was snapped and his spine shattered before he sensed that anything was wrong. Yudai, meet my boyfriend, Kushina grinned, studiously not looking at Koshoku's twitching corpse. Minato, meet Yudai. Not only is he one of the planner and plotters, he tried to kill me and Mikoto. This is your boyfriend. Yudai snorted, swiftly regaining his composure. You managed to find a mindless werewolf and train it? I'm almost impressed. The werewolf stared coldly at Yudai as he loomed over Koshoku's carcass and slowly flexed his claw-tipped fingers, flicking Yudai's bloody earring aside. Trusting Minato to handle things, Kushina turned the majority of her attention to the Uchiha just behind her. So, you set Koshoku on fire. It seemed worth trying, Mikoto shrugged, her pale face tight with pain. Well, thanks, Kushina muttered awkwardly. Mikoto was her friend, but she was also an Uchiha, a human ninja taught from childhood to hunt demons and that Kitsune in particular were deceitful monsters that were never to be trusted. Instead of helping, Kushina had expected her old pal to either attack all the Kitsune, or stand aside and doing nothing as the three demons fought to the death. Yet Mikoto had only set fire to Koshoku and had made no move to harm Kushina. So, can you walk? We should get out of the way. No, Mikoto sighed, blinking her eyes and turning her eyes from red back to black. I think my ankle's broken. Is that really Minato? I'll give you a ride then, Kushina said and flopped down on her belly so that Mikoto could crawl onto her back. And yes, it's Minato over there, about to eviscerate that bastard. Yudai made an insulting sound when he heard her comment and his six tails crackled with violet electricity. But when the dark blue fox tried to fire off the demonic bolts, the lightning barely went a foot before it slammed into a swirling barrier of wind. Even though his large claws made hand seals tricky, Minato had little trouble trapping the Kitsune in a simple vortex Adirank futon jutsu. I don't think I'll ever understand how a gust of wind can beat a bolt of lightning, Kushina mentally muttered as Mikoto hesitantly arranged herself on the vixen's back. But stupid as it is, I can't complain. How fortunate that Minato's affinity is the perfect counter. Yudai is so screwed. Once she thought that Mikoto was settled, Kushina carefully rose to all fours and trotted to the edge of the roof. When she tried to jump to a neighboring warehouse, she didn't completely compensate for the extra weight and she landed hard. Mikoto choked on a whimper as her damaged ankle was jarred. Sorry, Kushina winced. I don't have much practice giving rides. Naruto was so much smaller the last time, and I never carried him around up on roofs. Mikoto said nothing. Yudai gave up on his lightning Kitsune with an angry snarl. Minato cancelled the vortex and almost casually gathered a Rasengan in the palm of his right hand. The Kitsune barely glanced at the concentrated chakra storm before charging. Minato was suddenly right beside Yudai instead of yards away. His left hand closed around the Kitsune's neck and he heft the demon's upper half into the air with ease. Before Yudai could recover or react beyond a choked gasp, Minato thrust the destructive sphere into the fox's flank, just underneath the ribcage, and mangled his guts and backbone. The werewolf released the large fox's neck and the demon dropped like a string-cut marionette, vomiting blood when he impacted the roof. Stupid and mal, Yudai gurgled feebly. Don, you know, why posed T, lose. Just a dumb BBOS. With a wet cough his body shuddered and went limp as his blood and pulverized guts puddled around him. It really is Minato, Mikoto breathed. He must have tagged that Kitsune when he first arrived. Thanks for the save, Minato. Kushina cheerfully shouted over to the werewolf. I don't know why you were whining about thinking like an Omega before you totally dominated those creeps like an awesome alpha wolf. Minato gave her a bashful wave before winking out of sight, off to answer some other summons and kill some other enemy. You can understand with werewolves? Mikoto asked. Not when he's like that, Kushina replied. But you know all those stories about that creep Madara that said that he could switch between forms whenever he wants that everybody thinks is total BS? Well, apparently it's not all total BS. Kushina scanned the small sea of warehouse roofs and picked a direction that led back to the stadium and followed it, doing her best to make smoother jumps and gentler landings to avoid irritating Mikoto's ankle. Did Minato know about you? Mikoto inquired after several minutes of slow travel. Not until recently, Kushina answered, then plowed headlong into awkward territory. Hey, Mikoto, I'm sorry about not telling you. I really couldn't, you know? Even if I'm not going to worry about it right now, Mikoto declared. I don't have time. Konoha is being invaded and I need to find Sasuke. I'll figure it out later. Good plan, Kushina said with a grave nod. Let's do that. Maybe, just maybe, the fox thought, trying not to hope too much, we can still be friends. Kaito glowered at the cursed sword, Kusanagi. The dimmed blade didn't need to be held in Orochimaru's hand to be deadly. All that it needed was a steady stream of the Hanyu's chakra and some minor direction. Every time Kaito felt that he had the sword's pattern down, or it had slowed due to Orochimaru casting a jutsu on Sarutobi, he would try to slap a seal on it to eliminate it from the fight, but Orochimaru would notice and Kusanagi would dart out of his reach or swing wildly, forcing Kaito to back off. And every time Kaito sought to attack Orochimaru directly, the floating weapon would seek to carve out his kidney or slice open his spine. I really hate this sword. His foxfire only made the blade get hot. The sword, like many legendary swords, was demon-forged and was therefore nigh unbreakable. Worse, in addition to its ability to be semi-independent of its wielder, its edge was keen enough to cut through stone, which made it worse than foolhardy to try and grab it or hope that it would get stuck in anything. If only this damn thing would let me sit still just long enough to cast a genjutsu. If he'd had the opportunity to cast even a single layer of illusion, he could escape the stabbing point of Kusanagi and attack Orochimaru while the Hanyu was still primarily focused on his petty vengeance against his old sensei. A few good attacks from him would help Sarutobi overcome his former pupil, or at least weaken him to the point that he couldn't keep Kusanagi going so that Kaito could double-team him. And once Orochimaru was eliminated, the battle would be half won. Oda Gakure would be leaderless, leaving the Metazushio foxes and their allies as the only serious threat. But he had no time to focus and craft an illusion that would allow him to escape the sword and strike out at its distant wielder. Duck. Dodge. Spin. Flip. Kawarimi. Doton wall. Roll left. Kitsunebe. Duck and dive. Jump right. Kaito hissed as the blade grazed his bicep, slashing open his sleeve and drawing blood. I really hate this sword. While Kaito was kept occupied, Orochimaru did his best to mess with Sarutobi's head while they dueled with taijutsu and ninjutsu. The half-snake wickedly taunted his old mentor with memories of the past when he'd been the dutiful, beloved student. And the move Sarutobi was dragged down memory lane, the more likely he was to forget the present and the big picture, and make a stupid mistake. It would be great if I could get some help in here, he grumbled as he released a smoke bomb to obscure his exact location. But these teenage bodyguards of Orochimaru are good. Their barrier is solid and they've managed to protect themselves from any attack. Kaito almost bent over backwards as the floating sword slashed blindly through the smoke, seeking a lucky hit. He would have tried to lock down the weapon under his little smoke screen, but it was flailing so wildly he was liable to get his hand or even his head lopped off before he could get the chakra-blocking seal set. Clenching his sharpening teeth, Kaito rolled out of the smoke and waited for the smoke to follow, weaving an illusion and vainly hoping that he'd have time to complete it before he had to move again. Zap crack. Snapping his head towards the source of the racket, Kaito slowly grinned as he saw what was happening. Several fully transformed Kitsune had made it up to the highest stadium roof and were interfering with the square barrier that locked him, Hiruzen, and Orochimaru away from the rest of the village. One or two hovered at the midpoint of each side of the square, equidistant from the corners where the Otonin generated their barriers, and tried forming small barriers of their own perpendicular to the current barrier. With skill, strength, and more than a little luck they could tear a hole in the wall of energy, if not short-circuit all the barriers and neutralize the Otonin powering it. But even if they couldn't manage a single tiny hole, their efforts made plenty of noise and a fine distraction. Baring his fangs in a feral smile, Kaito dashed to Kusanagi while Orochimaru and Hiruzen gawked at the pair of Kitsune attacking the north side of the barrier. He caught the sword hilt and started forcing a crude fun on the handle. His skills with seal work were mediocre at best, but a simple chakra block was well within his capabilities. The sword bucked in his hands 3 times before he overpowered it and the animated weapon clattered to the red-tiled roof. Now if that Hanyu brat wants to use it, he'll have to swing it around in his own hands like any other creature. How irritating, Orochimaru hissed, reluctantly tearing his eyes away from the multi-tailed foxes to glare at Kaito. I really wished that you hadn't decided to interfere. Without your meddling, my business with Sensei would be complete and I could hunt down those fine Kitsune specimens out there. They are far superior to that senile elder and the infant pups I have gotten my hands on so far. So Kurohi sold out an oldster, too, Kaito murmured more to himself than anyone. He narrowed his eyes at the snake-like man and raised his voice. I don't suppose you'd tell me if those babies are still alive, would you? For now, the Hanyu smirked cruelly. Should I acquire more desirable specimens, however, I'll find some use for them. Young creatures can be so fragile. If you wanted to get your scaly hands on more mature Kitsune, Kaito responded, forcing back his rage and disgust, all you had to do was capture those Kurohi that you met with. Orochimaru narrowed his golden eyes and pressed his thin lips into a frown. Remember what I told you, little Naga, Kaito taunted, preparing his imaginary knife for a brutal twist, I am what every citizen of Uzushio is. Kaito lurched forward and dropped onto his hands and triggered his change. 6 tails, deep gray with a black band running between the gray fur and the white tips, sprouted from the base of his spine and lashed over his curved back. Gray, black, and white fur spread over his bare skin as his skull stretched outward and reshaped. His unmangled ear grew into a black furred triangle and his pupils lengthened into vertical slits. The joints in his limbs restructured for quadruple locomotion and his hands and feet shrank into sharp claws paws. As his transformation completed itself, Kaito dropped his lower jaw in a canine grin. The Kitsune that you so covet have been under your nose the whole time, he mocked cheerfully. How does it feel to have been so cleverly tricked? So thoroughly used? Orochimaru's narrow face briefly twisted into an ugly mask of naked rage before, with clear effort, he smoothed it back into a more neutral form. I see. I appreciate your information. Orochimaru pulled a seal-stamped medallion from inside his shirt and channeled a quick burst of chakra through it. Once I finish dealing with you, I believe I'll leave for Uzushio to harvest some new subjects. Hiruzen had recovered his breath by now after a brutal and relentless taijutsu dance Orochimaru had chased him through, and now he generated claws of stone to try and crush his former student's legs. Orochimaru slithered clear of danger, but Kaito was on him, no longer held back by the Hanyu's wretched sword. The half-naga was a graceful dodger, but he was not used to avoiding 6 tail strikes at once, and Kaito managed to put 3 tears in his clothes and draw a bit of blood on Orochimaru's cheek before the rogue could flip clear. Ha, now the gloves are really off. In the same moment that Orochimaru pushed a chakra surge through the medallion around his neck, all the control collar sets in Uzushiagaku no Sado's possession catastrophically failed. More than half the creatures under control had been killed, and so they were unaffected. But the controlled creatures that were still alive were suddenly free of any compelled rage or physical control. The 8 surviving Eagle Tengu came free with harsh cries of confusion and rage. They shucked the seal-covered collars and monocles, hurling them to the village below with disdain. Then they climbed high into the sky, shredding their distant crow demon cousins with extreme prejudice as they made their escape. This wasn't their territory, and they had no interest in quarreling with humans over land that was not their own. The reaction of the enslaved werewolves was more varied. A few remained locked in berserk rage until they were killed. Those that were already badly wounded wolves stopped their insane thrashing to wail in pain until they were mercy killed by the nearest ninja. And the rest, the minimally injured and the few completely untouched, stopped mid-motion and looked around in fear and complete disorientation. The bulk of these survivors had the great misfortune to be near, or be surrounded by, ninja of the Uchiha clan. Now that they weren't rabid berserkers, they were much softer targets, and the Uchiha took full advantage of it. They completely ignored the fearful yelps, gestures that pled for mercy, and grovels of surrender as they put their silver blades to work. Their shameful, disowned ancestor had brought this scourge to their land, and it was the duty to eradicate it without hesitation, to slowly expunge the stain on their good name. Only 3 werewolves survived the bloodbath. One female, who had been a vain and childish teenage prostitute, took one look at the squad of kunai-wielding chunin surrounding her and burst into tearful sobs. Startled and then overwhelmed by pity, the young men, very cautious, tried to comfort the slender, undersized werewolf instead of killing her. They ended up luring her into an ice cream parlor with candy and ice cream, while the fastest of them tried to find someone high-ranked to figure out what they were supposed to do with a weepy lycanthrope. Another, who had been, and still was, a happy alcoholic, awakened near a bar. Having been without a drink for a long time, much longer than he realized, he completely ignored the ninja around him, various members of the Yamanaka, Akimichi, and Nara clans, to run inside and dive behind the counter. The bemused shinobi found him eagerly guzzling straight from the taps, getting less than half the beer in his mouth. When he eventually noticed the hunters, instead of attacking them, he cheerfully offered them some random bottles of booze. Seeing that he was contained and would shortly be unconscious from overindulgence, the ninja drew straws to see who was going to find Inambu to alert the Hokage that there was a werewolf that he could study. And the last, a former beggar and aspiring thief, had the good luck to find himself in the company of the Inyazuka when he returned to sanity. The Inyazuka were startled to hear him making sounds that made sense in their ears. The werewolf was startled when he caught sight of himself in a mirror on display in a shop window. There was denial at first, but when he saw his hands furry and clawed in his tail and his naked body coated in a shaggy pelt, he was overwhelmed with horror. One of the Inyazuka happened to be Vet, who had happened to bring her medical bag with her. Her emergency supply of sedatives was the only thing that prevented the cursed creature from completely shredding his own face in an attempt to get the monster out. A 4th werewolf almost made it. The former laid-off factory worker had been cornered by a pair of Uchiha Itachi and his cousin and sometimes girlfriend, Chi. When the caller's influence ceased, the burly brown wolf blinked owlishly, saw their silver blades, and fell to his knees, hands clasped in a begging gesture. Itachi hesitated. Chi didn't. Ha! I killed it all by myself while you held back like a chicken. Chi giggled and wiped a few spots of blood from her cheek. You're never going to live this down, Itachi-kun. The clan heir said nothing and turned away, feeling vaguely ill as he reviewed the slaughter of the pleading monster that his Sharingan had burned into his memory. Somehow it just didn't seem right. Yuta sipped at the tea he'd brought with him in a thermos as he sat on a moss-covered fallen log. All around him the 50 most trusted of his village labored on their special task. They had started later, traveled a bit farther than the rest, and there had been some unexpected delays, but now they were on track. Yuta-sama, a Mayuboku fox said to him with a slight bow. We have mapped out most of the boundaries, but a few tails still elude us. At a gesture, the black Kitsune showed him a rough map sketched out on a blank scroll, and after a moment's consideration, Yuta nodded decisively. It's good enough. Pass the order to set the charges. Once the trees are destroyed, we can start arranging the sacrifices. Hi. The elder fox repressed a smirk as he watched his orders being carried out. The interference of the Uzumaki and the other foolish foxes allied with them was a serious crimp in the Kurohi's plans, but not entirely unexpected after their secret flight from the village. But there was no way that they would be able to stop this. They won't see this coming. And once we finish here, our weapon will have the humans gibbering with fear while we wipe out the hiding places of the Uzumaki, Hoshitama, and Furukawa one by one. Then it will be time to take up the Kyuubi no Yoko's work, the right way this time. The loss of the enslaved werewolves and eagle demons was no problem at all. He had anticipated that Orochimaru might try to double-cross them and sabotage the control collars he'd given them, so their plans didn't hinge on the creatures that wore them. The werewolves had been a weapon of terror and vengeance, and controlled or not they would serve their purpose perfectly well once they were within Konoha's walls. And the Eagle Tengu had been a way of beefing up their air force just a little bit, but they had more than enough Crow Tengu to make the Eagle's loss nearly painless. The bulk of their forces needed no collar to compel them to fight. The Crows would do just about anything to participate in mayhem that would net them free food and as much sparkly loot as they could carry. The Spiders would prey upon anything, but they viewed human meat as a delicacy. And the rest were Kitsune of Uzushiagaku or no Sato, all volunteers who had an axe to grind or a desire to slaughter humans, or both. It's too bad that the collars didn't last longer, though, he mused as he polished off his capful of tea and poured another. Werewolves would make useful servants, uncomplaining and capable of tormenting human prisoners. However, there is that drooling problem they seem to have. Several letter bombs were triggered a good quarter-mile away and several massive trees toppled sideways with agonized groans. Soon, now, very soon. Chapter 56, Curse vs. Curse. He was going home. He was lost. There were trees everywhere, and they all looked the same. His family was waiting for him. Crashing recklessly through the leaves, he sprinted faster and faster in search of the way he had to go. He had to hurry. A branch snapped under his foot and he fell and flared his wings to control his descent as his lungs burned for more air. When he got home, everything would be all right. His claw nails scrabbled at the tree bark as he climbed up the nearest tree so that he could continue his mad dash. He didn't want to be late. He sensed something and paused, strained his ears, sniffed the air, narrowed his eyes, licked his lips. He was being pursued. He was going home. Baring his teeth in a feral snarl, he set about hunting the hunters, moving in a wide arc towards the direction he felt they were in. He had to go home. In the distance he could see them, 3 of them. His mother and brother and father were waiting for him. They moved at a steady, purposeful pace, flitting through the canopy. They were coming after him to stop him. He didn't have time to waste, he had to go home. They were just like that man with the needle in his mouth, they were going to make him stop. He couldn't let anyone stop him from making it home. His spiny, leathery wings tensed and furled as his eyes watched them tree-hop along the trail he'd taken. He was going home, and, to do that, he was going to get them before they got him. What the heck is he doing all the way out here? Naruto wondered aloud as Shino followed all the broken little branches and scuffed tree bark that marked Sasuke's passage. Maybe the transformation has him disoriented, Shikamaru theorized. He's definitely not behaving rationally. In order to avoid being mistaken for an invading monster, he should have stayed where he was in the arena. I believe we are gaining, Shino reported. The signs appear to be growing fresher. But you're not sure? Naruto frowned. I can't tell. I'm not that good at scenting yet and, I think Sasuke smells different. Kiba is the superior tracker, Shino responded simply. My primary tracking methods involve my insects and I have not planted one on Sasuke. It's too bad that Neji got his neck cut open, Shikamaru muttered. His Byakugan would be able to locate Sasuke a whole lot faster. Do you think Neji will be okay? Naruto inquired as they slowed their pace slightly. I don't like the guy but, a slashed throat. There wasn't a lot of blood and he didn't seem to have any trouble breathing, Shikamaru shrugged. It's probably not too serious, but he won't be able to fight unless a medic clears him. Shino suddenly put on the brakes and Shikamaru and Naruto had to jump to the side to avoid stumbling into his back. What the heck, Naruto sputtered. This broken branch, Shino said, pointing to a snapped tree limb a few feet ahead of them, seems to indicate that he fell here. It will take a few moments to determine his trail. Naruto opened his mouth to complain, but a creaking sound caught his attention. It was faint but it sounded close and there wasn't nearly enough wind to make any branches wave enough to make that noise. Feeling unnerved, he shifted his ears to better hear and locate the source of any other sounds. Naruto, your ears. Shikamaru trailed off uncertainly. The fox-eared boy ignored him. Another soft creak and the faintest rustling of leaves reached his hearing. His slit pupil eyes were drawn to a dense clump of leaves formed by the overlap of branches from two different trees just to their left a few yards away. Hooray! The leaves exploded and a gray winged shape surged at them with spinning red Sharingan blazing against pitch-black sclera. Jiraiya grimaced as he surveyed an alleyway choked with spider webs, wary for any movement that would indicate a trapped human or a lurking spider demon. Damned spiders haven't even been in the walls for an hour and look at all of this. After defeating the giant two-headed snake demon that had been summoned to crash through the village wall, Jiraiya had assisted the forces in that area in ridding it of invaders. Now that most of them had been taken care of or driven back out, he'd come to the sectors that had fallen prey to the spiders. His toads loved spiders and he'd summoned several mid-sized ones to hop around the neighborhoods and devour anything with 8 legs that they found. I wonder how they even approached the spiders, he muttered to himself as he used a broken broom handle to swipe at the webs so he could get a better look. Those things will even hunt and eat each other if the mood strikes them. Anything with a pulse is a meal, it doesn't matter whether it can talk or not. All he found were a couple of silk-wrapped cats that were beyond saving, so he moved on down the street. Everywhere he turned there were streamers of web clinging to light poles, fences, and the walls of buildings. He was careful to avoid touching them whenever possible. There was no telling which strands were sticky and which were not. I feel sorry for whoever has to clean all this up. Coming to an intersection, he found a cluster of Chunin regrouping. All of them had some white wisps of webbing clinging to their clothes and at least one of them had been struck by a venomous spider fang. One of them that had some medic training was trying to find some anti-venom pills while the rest were taking stock of what weapons they still had among them. They all looked tired and on the dispirited side and Jiraiya decided that it was his duty to re-inspire them. But he hadn't taken 2 steps in their direction when someone else bustled onto the scene. It was a woman which instantly grabbed his attention, wearing a green jacket and with her blonde hair pulled back in 2 loose ponytails. When he recognized, and decided that he wasn't hallucinating, his jaw found its way to the ground. Tsunade. She flinched and glanced over at him before returning to treating the spider-bitten Chunin, who was really starting to look sickly. Slowly shaking off his shock, the white-haired man walked over to the group of Konoha Chunin. The spider demon victim had a nasty puncture in his upper arm that was hideously discolored and sluggishly oozing blood. For a moment Jiraiya worried that Tsunade would shut down, but she recovered and waved over a dark-haired girl to handle the problem. When Tsunade took a few steps back to get some air, Jiraiya followed her to hover at her shoulder. Not to sound ungrateful, Tsunade hime, but what are you doing here? The answer that he received was a dark mutter that contained, guilt trip, old crone, and dozens of very unladylike words. Okay. I'll have to ask her again after a few bottles of sake. Well, I'm glad that you're here, he said, and looped an arm over her shoulders. I'm not, Tsunade grumbled. Remove that limb before I move it for you. Jiraiya hastily released her and took a step to the side. Shall we continue mopping up? Might as well, she sighed. At least your toads will be pleasant company. Yeah. Shikamaru was really starting to sweat as he watched Shino struggle to drain the transformed Sasuke of chakra with his beetles. The Aburame wasn't having much luck. Sasuke didn't seem able to predict the movements of Shino's insect swarm, but his gray skin was hard like stone and the energy-draining bugs probably weren't able to get through it to significantly weaken him. The Nara boy wasn't much better off than his insect-wielding comrade. He wasn't much of a taijutsu user and his ninjutsu was mainly based on shadow manipulation. When he fought on the ground, it wasn't too terribly difficult to ensnare his foe and force some kind of stalemate. But up in the trees, with a fast-moving and extremely aggressive opponent, it was much harder to make a successful connection with his Kagemon. Every time he launched his shadow after Sasuke's, the winged boy would move to another tree, exponentially increasing the distance the dark tendril had to traverse and the complexity of its path, and in no time his shadow would be at its limit and he would have to abort, and dive out of the way as Sasuke swooped at him like a mad bat. Naruto had been taken out of the fight in the first few seconds. When Sasuke had first appeared, he'd tackled the canine-eared boy, pinned him up against a tree trunk, and battered him several times in the head with his fists. By the time Shino had intervened by sending his beetles into the transformed boy's nose and ears which drove him to strike at himself instead, Naruto had been knocked senseless and the blonde had fallen onto a lower branch, out cold. Shikamaru had tried to check on him, but there hadn't been a long enough lull in the action for him to do so. This just gets more and more troublesome. Shikamaru was a speedy planner, but even he needed some time to sit and consider strategies. Sasuke never gave him that time. The ex-Uchiha was either at Shikamaru's throat, or Shino's. He never sat back and made his own plans, he just attacked. So far he hadn't said a word, he just screamed, roared, and hissed. As far as the Nara could tell, he had lost the ability to understand human speech as well as use it. We can't ask him to stop, we can't seem to make him stop, and he appears to want to kill us. I should have stayed in bed today. Grimacing, Shikamaru pitched backwards off the branch he'd been crouching on just as Sasuke zipped through the space that the Nara boy had just been. He landed several feet below, pivoted, and flung a single shuriken. With how badly this fight was going, he needed to conserve his weapons, at Sasuke's foot, hoping to cripple him. Using his wings, the former Uchiha managed a turn in midair that should have been impossible so that the throwing star sailed harmlessly past him and embedded itself in a branch several trees away. And then the gray-skinned boy drew another bead on Shikamaru and dove on him like an owl striking at a mouse. A small cloud of black insects swarmed into Sasuke's eyes, temporarily blinding him and giving Shikamaru a narrow escape. Howling in rage, Sasuke swatted wildly at the swarm, crushing dozens of beetles into paste. The one thing the cursed boy seemed to have figured out was that Shino was the one that controlled the pesky bugs, so he blundered off after the Aburame to put the swarming to a stop. When is this guy going to get tired? Shikamaru wondered wearily as he looked for an opportunity to take control of Sasuke's shadow, or a place to lay a trap if he had time. As he watched, Shino was forced out of cover by a wild swing of Sasuke's ugly hand-like wing that had he not moved would have taken his head off. The Aburame tried to get a level above Sasuke, but the transformed Genin's Sharingan predicted the move and he caught Shino by the ankle and flung him down towards the ground. Shino tried to recover, but gravity and inertia couldn't be defied and he slammed sideways onto a low bough hard enough to knock his shades completely off. A tiny corner of Shikamaru's mind noted distantly, with how obsessive Aburame are about their glasses, I would have thought his eyes wouldn't be so normal. While Shino was busy with trying not to fall to the distant ground below, his concentration on his insects collapsed and Sasuke was no longer suffering their harassment. Snarling in victory, the transformed boy moved to drop to Shino's branch. Shikamaru flung his third-to-last kunai and the diamond-shaped blade lodged itself into one of the knuckles of the right wing. The throwing knife only penetrated about 2 inches at most, but this attack finally seemed to cause Sasuke some serious pain. The former Uchiha shrieked and grasped at his wounded appendage, thoroughly distracted, for the moment. The Nara Genin started descending towards the ground where he would have an easier time pinning Sasuke down with his shadow, but hesitated when he noticed that Shino hadn't moved much. The now shadeless boy was clinging to the branch he'd collided with, looking exceptionally pale and struggling for breath. After a half-second's consideration, Shikamaru approached the stranded Aburame from a direction that hopefully would escape the mad creature's notice. Shino! Shikamaru hissed when he was a branch away, beckoning to the other boy to hurry. "Come on. I believe my ribs are cracked," Shino informed him between clenched teeth. "My swarm is agitated." Shikamaru leapt over to Shino's branch and helped the boy in the trench coat to his feet. There were 3 tree limbs between them and solid ground, and they made it down 2 of them before their time ran out. Sasuke finally managed to dislodge the kunai in his wing, noticed that his prey had moved, and returned to the offensive. "Rah! Down!" Shikamaru hissed, pulling Shino to the next bough before the Aburame was ready. "NNGH!" Shino wheezed, slipped, and pulled them both from the last tree limb straight to the earth. Sasuke scrambled down the tree trunk at them while they land-winded. Whhzzz crack. There was a flash of blue light, the sound of a firecracker, and then Sasuke crashed into the last branch before the ground with his shaggy mane of gray hair smoldering. Shikamaru blinked, dazed. "What? All right, Sasuke?" Naruto's voice shouted from above, slightly slurred by a swollen lip. "No holding back. I'm gonna kick your ass." Sasuke snarled and regained his feet to glare at the screen of leaves that hid his new target from his sight. He gathered himself for an upwards attack, and a sandal bounced off his head. The cursed boy flinched, hesitated, and when he was ready to try again a second sandal ricocheted off his left wing. The Nara boy slowly rolled to his knees and squinted at the leafy canopy. "That's him not holding back?" And then something hurtled into view. To avoid a collision, Sasuke leapt aside and glided almost gracefully to the ground. The thing chased Sasuke, forcing the shocked ex-Uchiha to back up away from the other genin until there was a healthy gap between them. Then Sasuke flared his hideous hand wings and stopped retreating, triggering a standoff between him and Naruto. Shikamaru wondered. It was certainly wearing the same new outfit as Naruto had been, minus the sandals, although the Hitayate had been moved from the forehead to hang around the neck. And the thing's form certainly resembled a werewolf, being furry, canine, and bipedal. But as Hinata, according to Ino, had reported, he looked very much like a yellow fox. At his question, the new creature raised a black hand paw in his direction, made a fist, and raised its thumb. Apparently taking that gesture as some kind of threat, Sasuke curled his hand wings over his head and roared. Responding in kind, Naruto howled almost exactly like a wolf and bared his mouth full of sharp, white teeth. Displays exchanged, Sasuke charged, and Naruto started throwing small blue fireballs that made noises like fireworks as they whizzed through the air. Shikamaru dragged a wheezing Shino to his feet and steered him towards cover behind a large tree. Troublesome. Naruto quickly found that Sasuke was a very hard target. His Kitsune easily destroyed bits of the boy's clothes, but barely left a burn on Sasuke's skin. Physical blows didn't do much better, it was like striking a stone. And although he wasn't using any jutsu, his Sharingan was active, allowing him to react before an attack was even launched. With his ugly hand wings increasing his jumps and boosting his speed, he was a lot nastier than the lion dogs Naruto had fought barely an hour before. And he wasn't out to kill Sasuke like he had been with the 2 demons. Taking advantage of Sasuke's complete lack of jutsu, Naruto used all the techniques that he had at his disposal. He generated handfuls of Kage Bunshin to attack his foe from several different directions simultaneously. He hurled kunai, shuriken, and even small rocks to try and slow him or make him stumble. And he used his Kitsune to knock him aside or briefly blind him with bright flashes. But Sasuke seemed to shrug off the damage like a duck shakes off water. The ex-Uchiha was breathing hard and stumbling more than he had been, but he still made reckless, aggressive charges like he had nothing to fear. There didn't seem to be any intelligence in his red, whirling eyes. All Naruto could see was madness and bloodlust. Maybe, I'm wasting my time, Naruto thought as he hurled a pawful of dirt into Sasuke's face, making the transformed boy scream and stagger back as it got into his eyes. Maybe Sasuke isn't in there anymore. Maybe I should just try and kill him. The thought made him shiver and brought to mind what he knew of the werewolf curse. Sasuke hadn't asked for this to happen to him. What if he was trapped in there, unable to control himself, or so overwhelmed with fear that he couldn't stop himself? If Naruto had found himself in a similar situation, he would hope that someone would restrain him and help him, not kill him. I wish Mom was here. The fox boy drew a kunai from his weapon pouch and lashed his bushy tail as he watched Sasuke rubbing frantically at his face, his wings half shrouding his body. She'd know what to do. She'd have a way of stopping him. His mother wasn't here, though. No adults were. There was just him and Shino and Shikamaru, and Shino seemed to be hurt. So it was up to him and Shikamaru to figure out what to do. Grasping the kunai ring end down, he darted and leapt to try and bash Sasuke over the head to knock him out, but the winged boy staggered back a step. Naruto landed awkwardly too far to strike but too close to be safe, and Sasuke blindly pushed him off his feet with a heavy handwing. With blazing, watery red eyes, Sasuke glared down at him and raised a foot to stomp on Naruto. Yet, he never followed through with the movement. Huh? Naruto blinked. Move already, Shikamaru grunted. I can't hold him still forever. Naruto scrambled to all fours and scampered a few yards away. Lurching upright, he saw that Sasuke's shadow was warped and stretched in a way that defied the sun's rays. The dark tendril snaked off to one side and looped around to the sheltered side of a leaning tree trunk, where Shikamaru crouched with his hands locked into the rat seal. Cool. Naruto yipped. Thanks, Shikamaru. Then, remembering that the Nara couldn't understand him, he flashed the boy another thumb-up gesture. I can't hold him for more than a minute or two, Shikamaru said. Hurry up and tie him up. Hopefully he's worn out enough to be restrained by wire. Having no wire of his own, Naruto trotted over to Shikamaru to take his before he tried to bind up the frozen ex-Uchiha. Shikamaru shifted his position and his shadow technique forced the curse-marked boy to move along with him. With his wrists held together out in front and his ankles pressed together, it was a lot easier for Naruto to bind his limbs. Once Sasuke's regular limbs were tied up, Naruto moved on to the hand wings that jutted out of his back. There wasn't much wire left and he could only make 2 loops around them before he had to tie it off. Okay, Shikamaru sighed, his voice sounding a bit strained. I'm letting him go now. The link between their 2 shadows snapped. Sasuke flailed like a mad creature, straining against the wire that bound him. Ninja wire was flexible, but extremely tough. Even the smooth stuff could cut into flesh, and the razor wire could slice through most bones if there was enough tension put on it. But Sasuke's gray skin was tough and he managed to snap the bonds on his wings in seconds. Troublesome, the Nara Genin grumbled, sank to one knee, and slipped into some weird kind of thinking pose. Naruto glanced frantically between the thinking Shikamaru and the struggling Sasuke, who was trying to gnaw the loops of wire off his wrists. Hurry, Shikamaru, hurry, huh? Sasuke's wild struggles suddenly slowed. The gray-skinned boy swayed and collapsed forward onto the leaf-covered ground. And then, after a few seizure-like spasms, he fell still. Nervously shuffling forward, Naruto picked up a small stick and poked at one of Sasuke's ugly wings. Hey, you alive? He must have hit the end of his endurance, Shikamaru theorized. It's about time. The gray tint to Sasuke's skin and hair started to fade and his freakish wings seemed to be. Ah, he's melting. Kaito bared his teeth in grim satisfaction as he set fire to Orochimaru's corpse. It had been irritatingly difficult to slay the murderous Hanyu, even with his full offensive power unleashed for the first time in a real battle. The Snake Man had swapped places with hastily formed mud clones to escape devastating attacks several times. And when he suffered a certain level of injury, he'd shed his skin like a snake and come up healed and ready to fight some more. He'd even summoned some larger snakes, making it tricky and dangerous to maneuver inside the barrier square until Kaito had managed to kill them. But as powerful as Orochimaru was, he only had so much chakra, and trapped in a battle he couldn't easily run from against 2 powerful opponents, it was just a matter of time. When Orochimaru found his back up against the wall, he triggered a nightmarish transformation. He shed his human form for that of a large white snake covered in hundreds of tiny snake heads instead of scales. It was the single ugliest thing that Kaito had ever seen, but it wasn't too hard to kill. Hiruzen had stunned it with several punishing blows from Inma's staff form. Kaito had fired an extra concentrated Kitsune orb down the white creature's maw. And then he briefly fused all his tails into a single long, sharp appendage and beheaded the snake. And now Kaito was roasting the body while Hiruzen kneeled by the decapitated head and mourned his beloved student as privately as the situation allowed. Good riddance to bad rubbish, Kaito muttered and sneezed at the reek of burning monster flesh. Seconds after the serpent's death, the Otonin maintaining the barriers had collapsed in sudden agony. Without their focus, the barriers came down without the Kitsune attacking them having to do anything. Now several Umbu squads had come into the previously sealed-off battlefield and encircled their elderly leader. Satisfied that the body would soon be ash, Kaito trotted to the edge of the roof and stared down into the arena pit at the heart of the stadium. All the Otonin had been killed or captured, and the Kurohi allied foxes had either been slaughtered or chased off. Konoha milled around, resting or getting their wounds treated. The fight here was over in this part of the village. Kaito jerked his head at a fox that had slipped up onto the roof seconds after the barriers had collapsed and the violet-furred vixen slunk over to his side. "Status report," he demanded. "Konoha is slowly being cleared of hostiles," she answered promptly. "I don't have any hard information or any solid numbers, but the attack on the school was foiled and all the werewolves seem to be dead. There have been a few clashes with Uchiha, but I believe we were able to get away from them without killing them. We don't know how many Kitsune the Kurohi brought but..." Her black ears laid back in concern. "But it doesn't sound like enough of them appeared in Konoha. We don't know where the rest of them are." "Great," Kaito grumbled and watched as loyal foxes lounged around on empty stadium chairs as they waited to be redirected. "Just great." That's it for part 17. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.